I know. I have a pointer.
No. We were talking.
What? We had somebody had a pointer.
Gustavo
yesterday.
was the owner.
Not this morning.
Oh,
Ivan was using
Gustavo.
one this morning.
One was from Gustavo. No problem. I can use the.
Gustavo, I saw him walking the other way just now. He's in trouble. A mouse. Necessary. What time did I say? 15. I know, I have to wait for John. Oh, man, that's some people.
You guys are live.
You're live, man. You're live. You don't have to thank anybody.
Sorry?
You have a pointer?
No.
You were looking for one?
Yeah.
Here's one.
Edgardo.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, wow. Dahlia. You're too good.
Oh,
I
thank
told
you.
her she's good. China to do Sean. Just to do something different. Yeah. Well, it's interesting. Oh, it's interesting. I would do it too. Oh. It's gone. That's true. We're on TV. Is it therapy? We're on. I think we're good. Where's the Okay. How's the sound? Ivan, how's the sound? All right. All good. Okay. So, welcome back from lunch. Welcome back from lunch. Welcome back from lunch. We're live. Well, it's a great pleasure. Always a great pleasure. It is really a great pleasure to welcome back to Duke my great friend, our great friend, Catholic great friend, for a long time now. Since 2006, not that long. Our great friend Edgardo Latrubesse. We visited him in many homes. And we visited you in 4 different homes, in 4 different countries. And so I'm just going to say a couple of words about his background. But I'm going to forget exactly where you got your PhD. You got a PhD in geology at San Luis University in Argentina. And then he's been, I'm not going to be able to list them all, but he's been a professor at the Federal University of Amazonas, at the Federal University of Acre, at the Federal University of Goiás. We visited him there. I didn't count that one. Forgot to count that one. And then he moved to La Plata. He's a professor at the National University of La Plata in the beautiful city of La Plata, Argentina. He was a visiting faculty member, the Rivers Distinguished Professor at East Carolina University for 1 year. He's now a full professor at University of Texas, but he will be moving 99% sure to National Technical University, Singapore, the 11th highest rated university. That'd be awesome. Edgardo is a geologist, geomorphologist, and a bit of an activist, and he's going to talk about his work on and hydropower and damming the rivers of the Amazon. And this, he'll speak with great passion and tell us some pretty amazing stories about what's going on in the watershed and in the actual rivers of the Amazon. It's a very important story. So it's wonderful to have you back here, Edgardo.
Thank you very much, Paul. For me, always it's a pleasure to come here with you and also participate in this incredible multidisciplinary meetings because we learn a lot. And, it's really a big pleasure. I have good news and bad news. The good news is that I'm not planning to spend more time than planned with my talk. So that's the good news. The bad news is that probably I'm going to talk less as well. So I'm going to use the full time. It was time to make a joke.
The bad news also might be you need to use the microphone.
Yes.
Yeah, microphone. And that's the bad. That's important.
So let's move forward. Topic of today I'm going to present is down in the river of the Amazon basin. It's related to a paper that research that we have been doing in the Dean of College and publication you will see. But many people here have been asking me, what are you doing? You're specialist in that, but also in geology, with tethering, and so on. So I want to show you quickly what I do and who I am. So, as Paul said, I'm a geologist specialized in geomorphology and geology. And my focus has been mainly big rivers and big plants. So I research some of the largest fluvial basins on the planet at this moment. Many of them you will see in South America, or almost in Asia, and even the Mississippi in the United States. So my fluvial research program in Texas is called Large River Content Basin Evolution, Morphodynamics, and Geology. That's a nice title of issues. And we are trying to cover different of this topic of the XSOP. And you can see that the coverage is different than of space, two scales, space and time. So we can try to reconcile the long-term basin evolution and continental scale in the Amazon. This presentation, we have time to do that. All paternal records of the big fluvial system, how these rivers have been responding to all these changes in climate and tectonics and so on in the paternal, but also the production and routing of sediment at continental scale today. So how they work today, and this is related to the presentation of today as well as next. On the other side, we have more kind of morphological research. I developed concept of this in my discipline, this is geomorphology, so why some rivers are doing this kind of work, this kind of work, this kind of channel patterns can be developed one another. And many friends as well, very important topics in our discipline for the planet evolution, but as well applied science. So how we can transfer all this information to decision makers, the government, society, so human impact on river management is part of my research program. We can be contributing to this research to many projects, for example, we will see in the part of the topics, trying to put science on the table, take decisions on the future of this, of the management of the systems. So the school is linking past and present, so we use typical techniques and methods in paternal geology. Paul showed before, we can also get some show course in the hill, or describing the riverbanks, outgrowths. We work in collaboration with many other colleagues, chemistry, paleontology, paleontology, and so on. We have to do maps. We have to date the sediments as well with different techniques to typical traditional approach in paternal geology and geomorphology. How we work with present-day rivers? Well, this is a different approach because we have to understand the morphodynamics of the system, how the system transfers sediment, what is the hydrology, but also the transfer of sediment through this system. How we create a different landform that characterizes the river. So we use different techniques and activities. You can see any kind of box that we can get in different regions of work, and we can put some instruments to measure fields of velocity, water, the flashes of sediments, and so on, like push the top of the fiber, different kind of ecozones, single beam ecozone, multiple beam ecozones, and so on. And we have as well to date some of these sediment to estimate the recent rate of sedimentation with some methods like it can be lead 10 and water sampling and blah. And after we got through, and this is related to the question before, we do with all these materials. We go to the lab and we have to start to analyze these sediments in the lab, the outside, the concentration of sediment, the chemistry, etc. What I'm telling here in some way, I'm advancing you, that rivers are not just water. So we have a drainage network that are eroding reality of the continent. All this water is producing geomorphologic work. That means we have hydrology like the continent, that's correct. But the geomorphologic effect of all this river is eroding the continent, transferring all this sediment together with the water downstream in direction to a final destination that should be the ideal destination of the geomorphic system, that is the ocean. And of course, this can be a long way. You see here, we have a source area that produces good part of the sediment, the river transfer, the drainage system transfer all the sediment downstream to a final destination that should be the ocean that we call the Big Sink. Of course, in this long way, many things can happen. More sediment can appear as source of the river. In other parts that are not just these islands here, that can be in the middle of the way, and we can explore sediment as well in the middle of the way. So it's not so simple that we source to sink, straightforward. But in big continents like in South America, many of these intermediate situations can happen. Why is it interesting to study this? Well, we can kind of model this like a physical system, we can keep it opens. So we can develop a detailed model of landscape evolution, to establish chemical sediment balance, assessing how much sediment survives the ocean, and how much sediment can be trapped in the continents. And of course, many other applications. We can apply this to facilitate dams, or to freshwater coastal ecology, or to design river-based management strategies to mitigate hazards. I always start my discussion of South American rivers with the basic geography. And Paul has seen and covered this before many times. Well, where are the biggest rivers in water discharge? When we plot the 10 largest rivers in water discharge, this is the distribution in the planet. And you can see that we have in reality 7 rivers. So why we have 7? I'm telling you that we are looking to the 10 largest rivers of the world. So two of them are in Asia, the Yangtze and Brahmaputra. One is in Africa, Congo, one in North America, Mississippi, and 3 of them are in South America, the Orinoco, Amazonas, and Paramount. So where are the other 3? Well, they are in the Amazon Basin. The Amazon Basin is so spectacular, so unique, that hold many of the largest rivers of the world. Some 3,000 of the Amazon are top 10 rivers. So you see here the list of the 10 largest rivers of the world, and we have in green South American rivers, the Amazon, for the number 1, 210,000 cubic meters per second of green annual discharge. It's basically 5 times bigger than the second one, that is the Congo in Africa. So look at the difference in scale, it's huge. And after we got the Orinoco, that is very close to the Congo, with the Yangtze, Madeira is a tributary of the Amazon, number 4, very important river for the distribution of today. We have number 6, Negro, is another big tributary of the Amazon, the second largest tributary of the Amazon. After we have the Brahmaputra, everybody knows the Brahmaputra in Asia, but number 8 is the Chaparral of Caquetá. Caquetá in Colombia, Chaparral in Brazil, the same river with different names. Look at this size, basically, and a little bigger, even though the Mississippi keep down water. Practically nobody knows this river, listening to all. What river is that? And after we have the Paramount and Mississippi River to complete the list. The situation is even more spectacular when we compare the record of the tropics. This is published in 2005, was a very popular paper from geomorphologists. It's a tropical rivers published in geomorphology. And we have the list here of the biggest tropical rivers in this chapter. In red color appear rivers that are mainly Brazil. You see, you have many of these guys I mentioned before, but other popular rivers in Brazil appear as well. Tapajós is number 11, we have the Tocantins and Teen. Urus on the lowlands of Brazil, the Amazon is number 15. The Marañón is one of the rivers that form the Amazon is close as well. Xingu, everybody knows the Xingu here. We got the shift from this basin presented the movie yesterday. Eupiali, Madre de Dios, Isachu, Guanole. That's me. A bunch of these rivers are in Brazil, and mainly in the Amazon basin. So South America is not just a place to study it. It's a fluvial paradise. 24 of the 74 largest tropical rivers of the world in water region are located in South America, and 18 of them are related to the Amazon basin and the Amazon forests. So it's a very, very unique situation. If we put this in different environmental context related to the river, we say that this is the biggest environmental cycle of continental ecosystems in the planet related to rivers. Of course, it's the largest continuous belt of flatlands in the planet. In terms of biodiversity, we have the species here that can provide you a lot of more information than me, but for sure it's the largest and most diverse group as well as in the world. Good part of these areas in Brazil. Have some values here, biodiversity. This is our most presented today by my colleagues. It's updated every day. Every day, new species are being described. Fish, particularly as well. Every year, we have new species appearing. But we have an idea we have more than 2,000 species. Only in the Madeira, we have 1,000 species of fish. In comparison, the whole common basin have probably near 700 species. Here in the Mississippi, in Southern South America, we have nearly probably 300%. So there's a huge biodiversity. So not just rivers are very unique rivers. Well, but it's not all about water. We say that sediments are a very important component of the system because they are not only passive stuff that is being transferred to the ocean. They transport nutrients, they create the architecture of the floodplain that sustain the landforms that are the storage of this sediment. They sustain the ecosystems of the fluid system, the floodplain, but they are not in an empty space. They have been created by the sediment by their own river. So the sediment yields have been a very important solution in South America because when we compare the production of sediment and the transference of sediment to the ocean, we see that Southeast Asia have been very important. It's the most productive area of the planet for people saying sediment arriving into the ocean transferred by rivers. So why, if we have such big rivers in South America, we don't have this huge amount of sediment arriving in the ocean? Well, we can explain this in different ways. Like this first typical map by my colleague Nelliman and me, there was a very classic paper described here. Well, in general, a map like this, for people that is not trained, say, well, sediment yields in South America low because this big area probably is no more than 100 or 200 billion tons per kilometer per year. But that's not the reason. Another reason can be that this source-to-sink approach, part of the sediment that is produced in the areas of the mountains has to be stored in the continents. It's never arriving permanently to the ocean. So we did this, and everybody knows that the Amazon, one part of the sediment comes from the Andes. This is a small area, basically 12% probably of the area is just in the Andes. The rest is not counting in the terrain. So how much produce the Andes? So we started producing amber with my colleagues Juan Restrepo from Colombia, and we came up with the first assessment of sediment production in the Andes from the Caribbean to Argentina, looking how can this sediment is transferred to the east, to the biggest fluvial basins of South America. And we can see here, I'm not going to spend too much time, the huge amount of sediment is produced in the Andes, and this is sediment yield ton per square kilometers per year. Thousands of tons per square kilometer per year of sediment are produced in each of these small basins that transfer sediment to the biggest systems in the Orinoco, in the Amazon, and so on. At total, we assume that probably the Andes are producing 2.6 to 3.5 gigatons of sediment, basically on the east side. And of course, 90% of the total sediment transported by the Amazon is coming from this source. And we have the number here, I'm not going to explain much. Just pay attention to this value. When you see this beautiful area of the Amazon, Peru, and you show me one picture with the team of the NSF team, all shown as a very nice picture. In the Andes, very high mountain. They've seen that don't produce too much. But let's see what's happening, why this is happening. Well, where are the sinks in South America? See, this sediment is not arriving in the ocean, that's going to be stored in some place. Part is stored in the Piedmont, mountain valleys, close to the Andes. Part is stored in the large rivers. Part is stored in what we call megathans, very active rivers that shift and migrate and store sediment in the shifting. And other erosion system, also very dynamic system. So probably 0.5 to 1.7 gigaton was it very proximate to the Andes. Other areas also store a lot of sediments. The megathans of Chaco is in this area here, it's not in the Amazon, in the south, store many tons of sediment every year, 300 million tons never arrive basically to the ocean, they are stored in the continent. And very muddy rivers, very unstable rivers. The area is 800,000 square kilometers of megathans in China. Huge area. 60% of the sediment is trapped in the continent. We have in the Amazon basin, tributaries coming from Bolivia, depending on the system and so on. And they store also probably more than 200 million tons by migration. This sediment is not transferred immediately to the Amazon downstream. Stay trapped in the Bolivian plains. But other rivers that are we consider actual rivers, like the Amazon itself, also they store a lot of sediment. And they exchange sediment. When the river is moving downstream, produce erosional deposition, dynamic movement, and erosional deposition continuously downstream. And this exchange can be very huge. We don't know at all how much is. We have some estimation with one of our friends from California, Santa Barbara, and probably we have more than 500 million tons of storage of sediment downstream from here to the ocean. So there's a lot of material that they store. And a lot of more are also stored downstream on us, where we have some of the biggest barriers in the Amazon. These are the models that we are developing. This is 10-sediment concentration for the bars that we have a very detailed study here, how the sediment is moved through the Amazon system. And these red and yellow colors explain you how much sediment is transferred from the river to the bars. So the bars depend on this sediment every year. Well, but we have human input. We are modifying all these flasks. And what happened? Well, we know that deforestation, land cover change are very important. They modify the hydrological system at all. And of course, rivers are part of this. But also for rivers, very important thing are dams. Because dams represent the direct impact on the river. We are blocking the river. Think about your hand with blood flowing here, and we go tonic it with blood. Flow of blood in your hand. You're going to have problem, right? So the same is happening with the dam. So dams are the main deal in rivers. We have been modifying all these flashes to the ocean. This is some very general estimation that we have on a global scale. But more than 4% now, a little bit more is global discharge is intercepted as a not more natural flow of the oceans and so on. They produce a lot of negative impacts on river. It's not only ecological issues, but they also produce physical transformation of the river, channel change metamorphosis, and this produces also alteration of the ecosystems and so on. Well, what is happening in the Amazon? We were trying to produce a paper, and we published this recently. Down the river of the Amazon basin, we can see some multidisciplinary teams, and the author here, Camila was part of this, Paul was part of this, so a lot of people was part of this. We have Brazilian ecology, we have economists, we have social scientists. Well, in the Amazon, like in other parts of the topics, the construction of that can be increased rapidly, because it's formation. So we are trying to assess what should be happening in the Amazon if we get all these dams. Considering the planned dams in Amazonian countries, we could increase the number to more than 400 dams. That is a significant amount of dams. Many of these dams can be in different locations. Some of them are microtonic areas in South America, that mean the Brazilian Shield, the Guyana Shield, they don't produce much sediments, but others are related to the Andean tributaries in this area. The good part of the sediment is found by the Amazon downstream. How we assessing that? We did an index. We call that environmental vulnerability index, to measure different factors. So it was innovative because there is a discipline that I don't like, and it's very common now, that people call eco-hydrology. I hate eco-hydrology because hydrology is part of the pluvial system functioning, but water is not the main factor. Right? The rivers are alive, they move, they transfer sediment. So eco-hydrology says that we can find some miraculous number to say, well, we have some ecological discharge that's sustained by the diversity and so on. And this is very wrong because there's not a bigger one. Anyway, so we have been including these other factors here to cover these problems. So we include the basin integrity in this to see how the fluxes can happen in terms of the ocean in the basin and how much material area we can transform in future. This is protected or not, or can be deforested or not. The fluid dynamics index is a very interesting one. They will consider the dynamic of the river, how much rivers migrates, how much rivers also vertically oscillate in terms of water level, how much sediment is flowing through the system. Remember that when the river migrates, the operational energy force, they get new vegetation succession, new lakes, and so on. So river migration is very important. And the downstream impact index, that is the most simple, is well, how we are impacting dams, how many dams, how long tracts of the river we are blocking, and so on. Well, let's see some of these different rivers. The Latonic rivers, probably the most famous, the most important, of course, are the discharge, the Tapajos and Xingu River. Well, everybody knows the problems in Xingu because the construction of Belmont, one of the biggest dams on the planet, have been consuming probably 15 and $18 billion. Nobody knows yet how much money we spend there. Have been an area of extreme conflicts with the local people and indigenous people. So this was mainly in the media because there's reasons, mainly because of the environmental reasons. And I see that yes, it's very problematic, it's practically done, virtually finished. But the most problematic Latonic river in terms of dams is the Tapajos. Because the Brazilian government wants to create a sequence of dams in this river, blocking a huge area of more than 1,000 kilometers in length of a cascade of dams. And that should be creating artificial lakes in area longer than from Mississippi, from Memphis to New Orleans along the Mississippi River. That should be impossible in any developed country today. Think about a river, the dam, the lake that go from Madrid to even farther than Paris, right, in Europe. It should be ridiculous. And we have here the lobby of the government, hydroelectric has to ban. Tidal power is good because obviously we promote like clean energy. And this is part of the participation of Brazil in the global climate change program. Say, well, we are increasing our emission of carbon, and so on. And that was horrible for leaders. It was a justification for leaders to expand this project of dams. When we move to the Andes, it's even more problematic as well because we have a smaller country. When I say smaller countries, we have a big headache. Many of these dams in these countries have been promoted by the Brazilians. So their plan was to build this dam to export energy to Brazil. It was not to cover national demand. And well, this distribution you see in blue existing and under construction dams and yellow plant dams and the size of these dams. You want to go to the details. And in blue appear here is the sediment yields. You see in this part 400 million tons of sediment are transferred over the Amazon from the environment. And here in the south, 500 to 600 million tons are being transferred from the Andes over the Madeira River. That is very important. One of the top 10 large rivers in the world in water discharge and also very important in terms of sediments. All these sediments will sustain the marshes and floodplain in the Amazon, the Madeira, and downstream toward the Atlantic. Well, remember the Peruvian case. Look at how many dams we have concentrated in Peruvian territory. And remember my graphic? Say, well, it's not producing too much. It's not that it's not producing the Andes too much. That is the area with less information in the good Andes. So we are planning to build the biggest amount of dams in the area with the minimum amount of information that are sediment production. Right? That's very big. What's happening with the Madeira? The Madeira is an emblematic case because the Madeira provides 50% of the sediment of the Amazon. Yes, 50% of the sediment that the Amazon transports to the ocean is coming from this system. We have an idea that the Brazilians have been building here, they have complete 2 megadams, San Antonio and Chirao, in this area. And in this place, the Madeira River transports more water and sediment than the Yangtze River in 3 gorges. 3 gorges, big, small, spectacular dams in the planet, was very, very controversial. Well, we never practically hear anything about these dams. It was not controversial at all. It was approved in record time, the construction of this dam with the necessary studies. And the difference is, if 3 dams you have been there, this is barely a moment. This is 90 meters above sea level. So you cannot make any mistake here. You don't have space for mistake. This is lowland place. Right? Well, used to be area for more than 1,000 species of fish. We have the second class of properties reporting water discharge, the water of nature, now disappeared. And the dam started to operate. By the way, they want to build 2 big dams upstream in direction to the Madeira area. It's a complex of 4 dams, they built 2 already. So when this started to operate, you can see the Madeira here close to Porto Velho. They started to commemorate, to celebrate. You see how this Portuguese in the news, oh, we are using this amount of paper. And the next year we have this. This was the Victor presented before, yesterday, about the floods in Porto Velho. And so we start to get a strong modification in the system immediately after the dam started to operate. The situation is critical. We put this in our nature paper. We know that now at least 20% of the sediment concentration decreased because the dams are trapping sediments. The government has been promoting all these dams like, very effective to transfer sediment downstream to the run-of-river models of dams. But the fact is they are trapping a lot of sediment. We believe that 90% of the sands are very trapped, and more than 20% of the mud also very trapped. And this can be catastrophic to the river downstream. So, in conclusion, when we apply the Dept the index, and we combine all these sub-indices, we arrive at this conclusion here, and is that the malaria is the most threatened basin in the Amazon. And after we have the biggest problems in the Platonic rivers are in the, well, is Tapajos. And after we have in malaria. So this is a vulnerability of the rivers now. So what should be the most susceptible area, more vulnerable areas? Well, the problem is that when we approve that, we produce environmental assessment and we approve this project here, after we approve another project here, we have another project over there. So we are not combining these effects. All these combining negative effects in the fluvial basin. And so the government used this tactic to approve one by one all these projects. Well, but this is an interconnected system of draining 6 million square kilometers of South America. It's the biggest drainage systems in the planet. Think about, I still struggling to understand how you can interconnect the drainage area of 6 million square kilometers perfectly with channels, right? Creating a neighborhood is amazing. Well, that's it is. And we transfer millions of tons sediments to the ocean. When the Amazon arrives to the ocean and start the exploration of a pole, looking how these classes of sediment can be changed into time, the Amazon model, and how this produces information on the dynamic of the basins to time. Well, what we have today is that this huge volume of sediment can spread on nearly 1 million square kilometers in the ocean and transfer nutrients, fresh water to the ocean. Transfer, of course, a lot of additional ecological processes, fishing and so on in the mouth, depending on this flow of fresh water. And this segment also is transferred by marine and coastal mechanisms toward the north, along the northeast coast of South America. You see this in red color are the sediments here, moving toward the north, right? And this map is feeding good part of the big areas of mangrove that we have in this lake. That's probably the best preserved and largest areas of mangrove that remain in the continent. In addition to that, the water of the ocean. And there are some studies, all in Texas and so on, that suggest that this also affects the climatic circulation and the direction of tropical storm that can even arrive in the Gulf of Mexico. Of course, you can say, well, we need more evidence, so we can be discussing with Paul many times. But the point that I want to show is that this is the scale. This is something that can be even intercontinental in the hemispheric correlations. So the Amazon is not just a river, it's just a dam. It's just very, very unique in terms of scale. This is some simulation we are running. We are preparing another figure. What should be happening with the boom and the floodplains if we decrease 20, 40, 60, or 80% the transport of wash logs, the fine sediments along the Amazon. Now let's see if this works. This is a more temporal approach. You can see different scenarios, 50 to 60, 70% decrease and so on. So the impacts can be brutal. We can be suggesting what we can do with this. Well, we have the answer to the problem. We are pushing that this has to be an integrated assessment, and not just down by down. We suggest as well using the existing legal framework. When we submit the paper, say, why you don't do like in Europe? Why you don't do like in the home base? Never we are going to approve it. So we are suggesting is let's use this structure that we have. And what we have is ACTO, the Amazon Cooperation Treaty Organization. People say, well, it's not functional. well, that exists. We can change it, we can put this function. And we have as well legislation laws. In Brazil, the law of water is not bad. The Brazilian law of water is very advanced. The Brazilian law of water also considered the creation of basin canals and this is right? And we are going a little beyond and say, well, since this really works, maybe we can create a kind of a design like IPCC where we can provide information. We are not taking any a decision. We can create a policy control, but not policy perspective. We are not going to take a decision at all. We provide a report every year. I think it's very easy. Because the same happened with in some way with vegetation and deforestation. We start to produce every year deforestation of gas. Everybody's waiting this year. What is going to happen this year? What is going to happen this year? So society and politicians are looking. Well, in conclusion, I would like to. Do I have 5 minutes? Okay. And we will. Let me show you something else. Why we believe that this is going to be negative? We have plenty of examples in Brazil. This is the situation of the other rivers of Brazil. This is Paramount, San Francisco, and Tocantins. They provide a part of the electric power of the county. And basically, a part of the river are artificial. This is the Paramount River here. You can see all the dams. This is transformation dams. We have a lot smaller dams than not here. So basically, the river is running artificially from all the Brazilian territory. You can see here, this is from my friend, the colleague, who says, go back to the ancient paper. You see the longitudinal profile of the river. It's not the biggest dam. Two all broken, so all the conditions are artificial along the Paramount River in Brazil. This is, I think, the next challenge that we are trying to work on this. You know, the Amazon was the focus of all these environmental policies, but the Cerrado was destroyed for years. The Cerrado, here in many of these slides today by geography and so on, was the biggest area of kind savannas in Brazil, 2 million square kilometer area that have been totally destroyed. Basically, more than 60 to 70% of the area was destroyed. And this is the area where some of these big rivers born. The Tapachas born in the Cerrado, the Xingu born in the Cerrado, the San Francisco, the Carvalho, the Tocantins, the Paraná, all these rivers are born in the Cerrado, in central Brazil. Well, the destruction was so massive, this has been considered the hotspot for biodiversity, close to extinction, all this ecosystem. But now, I think we have the last attack, and the last attack of the water resources and aquatic ecosystems. We have, as 2016, the kind of 200 power plants, and many others are under construction. So we are expanding the number of hydroelectric plants in the area 1,000. That's what was planned by the government. 152 hydroelectric plants, 746 more hydroelectric plants. We planned in the Cerrado. You can see the colors here, red colors, all of this plan. But why we need this? This is the situation of the Cerrado. This is the figure we are preparing now. Is that the deforestation rate of the Cerrado. You can see yellow color all disappear. In light green is conservation areas. Green will remain, kind of natural condition. When you feel the leaf a couple of days, all this is yellow. So this is nice green. And yellow and red is the expansion of deforestation. We updated this in 2017. Look how it's moving. It was moving here, but it's not moving more because we don't have more space. Here it's moving out over the Bahia and so on. What remains percussion? Nobody has been working percussion on the defining conservation areas, and this is a disaster. But we have to consider water in the equation. We consider area for biodiversity. We have to consider areas also for water sources and the aquatic system. So our suggestion, the only option we have is to say the Arabian basin here, because this conservation area will form on wetlands. All this is it. There are things. There's the last frontier, the pressure of discussions and the moment answers. Well, so I think, in my opinion, the Cerrado is facing the second catastrophic wave by degradation. We have even more pressure. This is the map. Irrigation with pivots and tides. This is all for irrigation. Waterways and so on. So this, I believe, is the coup de grace that can make possible the most catastrophic scenarios of extinction of the Cerrado in a couple of decades. We need a very urgent policy. In conclusion, all this based on a very modified, regulated, and fragmented exponential velocity and exponential rates. Persistent this model of development, the natural condition of the Amazon will be deeply impacted in 2 or 3 decades. Not too much time. We believe that it's possible to use and adapt and make it more efficient the existing institutional legal framework and is pushing to find some basic management plan. Even an international scale with neighbors. We have to include the people that is not participating. Of course, we have to be involved, but we have people like you here, working in Manaus and others, and I say, well, you have to be aware that the dam in Peru is going to affect this Amazon as a state, and that Pará state is going to affect not only the dams in the Tapajos, but it's going to be affected by the dams in Rondônia. And this is what we don't have. These persons are not getting the perception that they have to be involved in all the stages of the discussion. And we have to include Guyana and the French Guyana, and so on. So that's the message that I hope you can help me to disseminate this. Okay, so you want to work on this? Thank you.
Oh, we have time. Really, Mike, you were rushing, and Mike starts at much. Mike's starts at 2:30. So we have time for some questions. I think it's pretty important. So, Bob and then Victor.
If you can talk a little bit more about what you mean by sediment. It strikes me that there must be tremendous variation depending on the soil it comes from. And also, I would think of like a run-of-the-river dam would allow dissolved nutrients in maybe some kinds of sediment that pass through where another dam wouldn't.
Yeah, absolutely. When we include here the different factors, the different vulnerabilities in that, the index is considering that. Rivers, like you say, the cratonic zone, they are not producing too much sediment, so the rate of sediment is more. But what is more important in this river for the ecology have been the flat coasts. In other rivers, it's a combo. So we have the fragility of the river is in terms of the sediment, because the sediment triggers the lateral dynamic of the river. So all this ecosystem can be renewed. It's a totally different dynamic than rivers in the Craton. So sediment for this river is fundamental, not necessarily for the others. So this is a thing that we have to filter. And that's the point. Practically nobody did it. So we are putting all in the same bag and creating some hydrological parameters, how we modify a river. Basically, all the studies have been on hydrology, not on geomorphology and sediments. Regarding the discussion on what kind of dams we build, this is also important because what I was trying to say probably was not clear, is that the government can be promoting around river dams, like enormous, like not dangerous for the environment, because all should be half and downstream, it should be not tapping sediments.
Well, that was part of the speech, and we are demonstrating that what they consider to be okay is not, like the Madeira case, that the trapping of sediment is significantly bad. So it's not something that we can believe them, because when they say that, is the way to approve quickly the environmental impact assessment and the license to build that, right? So the dams of the Madeira are the biggest in the planet, runoff rivers dams. So we are planning to do now, and we're discussing with you, with Camila here, is putting a multidisciplinary paper to show the real impacts of these runoff river systems, and not necessarily what the government say. Of course, they allow more transfer of sediment than the traditional reservoir. That's not discussion, right? But when you put 4 of these in continuity, good part of the sand is not passing at all. And they were assuming that the wash holders would be mud and clay should be passing practically 100%. And we got at least 70% or more of increase. The big problem why we submitted papers and journals and so on, this discussion, you know, with the sediments, is people don't understand sometimes the mechanism of sediment transport. Sounds deliberate. The amount of sediment that this sand in suspension is big, because the textbooks say, well, we have other clay suspension and bedrock with sand moving to the bed. In reality, we go part of the sand into the suspension. And in Mississippi, for example, we have been studying, can be more than 60% or something like that, that the amount of sand suspension in relation to the water suspended flow. In the Amazon, the same, we produce only water. Got a different of 40% because they don't consider the sand suspension in the system. They can be debated between a different group, French and Americans. Okay, the Amazon transport 1 billion tons, and the others say no, transport 600 million tons. It's because how you measure the sediment move. So this is another big problem. And people is more tempted to create universal model and satellite monitoring with sediments in this way. And it's very, very complicated. So I believe the sediment is the most sensitive problem, because sediment also modulates the dynamics of the river. And for the Amazon, it's important because it will sustain the mosaic ecosystems in the floodplain. Right? It's not just that, okay, we put some nutrients like, you know, since the ships and we know that the sediment was fundamental for agriculture, right, in the floodplain. So we can't if we want to build this up. Well, it's not just that, it's passive transference in the flood. Sediment to the floodplain, if we remove, they are creating new section of vegetation, new lakes, and so on, that help to keep the biodiversity. I don't know if that's answered more or less the questions, okay?
Two questions. So, if Brazil stops to build these dams, if we know how many years it's going to have this system back as normal? And second one, I mean, you have a very good solid data there, but I think no politician in Brazil reads Nature, scientific journal. And you know, if you are working, and I saw that you are working also trying to work with Acto, but have you ever tried to get people from AMEL? And if so, I know it's not an area of expertise because those politicians, they need the challenge and the solution. Have you tried to combine with some from renewable energy, scholars from Texas, whatever, to get like a solution to us?
Well, partially. I know that they don't read Nature, but they are aware of what we publish in Nature. Create a big impact, create motion. One of the objectives we created is we produced this paper, it was creating motion because Brazil was an apathy until a couple of years ago about this problem. So to generate this paper takes a lot of time, a lot of effort. So when we started to do it, was before the scandals with dams. So nobody was talking about that. Many people were doing business and happy with it, and was not questioning the So now we are talking more, and we can accumulate more articles and more people participating. And we are giving also information to the social actors that are fighting locally for that, like happening in the Xingu and so on. We have more and more evidence put on the table. We have a number of University of Florida that's managing this network. There's a lot of people who will see many scientists and people in non-governmental organizations, etc. Even from Ghana is participating. So we are in some way transferring this, and they know that this is a movement. So this is, how things work. Many of our colleagues have been consultants in these projects. They colleagues like people from IPA, right, National Finisola, I have been consultant in many other projects in the government. So we can be more or less inside. But of course we need more, and that's the reason I asked you. Help us, put the people from the Amazon as a state in this discussion. Because the focus on was forest, and I always repeat, forest, and almost we don't know the priority in the Amazon. And when the chief started talking, yes, the first explanation and concern was the Xingu River and how the water is going to modify pollution and fish. That's because the people live in it. That's the life. Right? We forgot. What I was saying, I was trying to push here to discussion on scale. The scale is huge in every sense. It's biodiversity, amount of water, blah, blah, blah. Right? So we cannot consider building a dam small creek in the Andes, building all these dams in the scientific system, responding completely in this. And I always say the same kind of story. So you have a guy that doesn't know what he has, and the value of the belonging that he has. For example, I got this painting from my grandma. I don't know what to paint. It's this. It's a nice one. But this is Picasso or Van Gogh. But the guy has no idea that this is Picasso or Van Gogh. And one day discussing with a girlfriend or a wife or whatever, or a friend, he said, I need some money. I said, it has to be immediate because we need to get some money now to solve our problems. There's the argument with this. It's pushing. It's tomorrow. We have to do this in a hurry because it's the economy. You know, the same argument. The pressure builder has to be right now. Well, say, let's sell this paint. Maybe we can change the car for a new one, and we can get 200 or 2,000 reals. You can go and sell it for 2,000 reals, satisfy the immediate demand. So this is what we are doing with the rivers, destroying all at once. The most biodiverse river of the world, some of the most beautiful river wonders of the world, like all these rapids disappeared. And why we have to do this in one generation? We need planning. And the planning that I suggest, that is not clear as well as I thought, is that Brazil was building this dam with a plan. They rescue the old plants where it should be possible to put the dam here, or there, where they mentioned in the webinar yesterday, where there was a neat point in the river, should be a good place for them. And this was before run-of-river mentality. Why you have to put now in the same place than in the 60s? In the 60s, nobody knows nothing about the ecology of the Amazon, but that was in project was in the 70s. And now that we know, why we don't organize a planning where we have to select the places. We can build some towns. And how many are necessary considering the 10, 20 years? The energy market is totally in transformation. So that's my point. Please.
If one of your major findings is that the sediment load has been largely underestimated, or the amount caught by the dams has been underestimated, do you find that that sediment will then be caught by the dams in a higher proportion than they're expecting? And do you think it's to the point where it will severely affect the energy that they expect to be producing from those dams?
Yeah, we didn't know exactly how this is going to modify the production of each project, because I don't have details for all projects are going to work. We are telling is that it was not considered the accumulation of impacts. So our colleagues in IPA and South North America have been working in 6 dams in Peru, and they estimate that 60% of the sediment will be trapped only with 6 dams. We are talking about hundreds. So it should be not crazy. If 6 dams modeling is there, and we're going to trap 60%, we accumulate more and more and more. Right? So, of course, this is going to affect the production of the dams, but I don't know in what scale and how we are going to estimate that. That's something happening in other places in the world. It's a common situation. The guys say, well, they want to keep this dam for 50 years, and after 20 years, full of sediment comes down to the bridge. It's a good thing because some additional guys are going to be more want to do it. That was happening very frequently in China. China has been in disaster for water resources. So that's way. But the other point is we're trying to show the people the connection, to show the people the scale of the problem, and what is the negative effect of sediment trapping, accumulated sediment trapping for the system. That's what they did. Okay.
Please forgive my ignorance if this is not something that is impossible, but as I understand, front of the river hydro facilities have a couple of stages where the sediment is filtered. So there is a first coarse filter where all the trash and big debris is stopped. And then there is a desander where there is some of the slow part of the channel where they just open doors to the sides and then the sand goes away. It looks to me that in small run-of-the-river hydro facilities, let's say less than 20 megawatts, it wouldn't cost much just to have a bypass on the sides, where these doors open so the sand goes to the lateral sides of the river. To bypass the turbines and then dump the sediment down past the turbines. Then, of course, you would have the problem of reduced river flow at some point. Well, actually, you only have reduced river flow on the elbow of the front of the river, but the rest is just keeping the same flow as originally. So it would be able to carry this sediment if you bypass the traffic. Is this something that
that's the argument.
technological solutions that people are discussing, or is this just something that authorities ignore and then it's just...
No, they are trying to do that, right? So the different designs say, well, we are going to allow the trapping of sediments, or we are going to allow also the passage of fish. In the case of Madeira, we would say that the amount of debris and rocks is so big, so they can be facing technical problems with that as well. It's not difficult that they were planning a lesion, respecting a lesion. So all this, in theory, is considered. The problem is how much efficient they can be to do. So Camila probably can explain more about the impacts on fish and so on, and the problems in the data can be very serious, and in other dams in Brazil as well. And it's fake news that they don't produce a reservoir. To operate in Madeira, they have to keep the river at back full, so practically at the high elevation level of water the full year. So the backwater effect is big. It's not that the river is just running, can you say, and transferring the sediment. So this backwater produces sedimentation upstream and flood the tributaries that also produce sedimentation locally, and so on and so on and so on. So it's not as nice as they say. And this is our discussion, because the same speed that you have in the months, the speed is not really the problem.
We can transfer the sediment, no problem. We can transfer the water, and we can transfer the fish and so on, so the impact is going to be minimum,
because we cannot have the technology that is running free. Well, that's the point. And big areas of the cratonic systems are not run river at all, and many of the dams in the Amazon, in the Andes, are not run river at all. So Santa, or there are not, 6 dams in the Amazon that are not in the Andes, not run river, it are expected to the same, trapping on the 60% of the sediment. And these that used to be, oh no, this is going to down for everything. Run river, the biggest in the planet. We said that this trapping 90% of sand, more than 20% of white. So San Xingu was wrong.
Also about the falsification of the cost-benefit analysis, you know, the false economies that they talk about. I mean, that's so consistent. You say something about that?
About the economy?
About
the price? Well, the price over the overrun can be huge on these projects. Many of these is more than 2-3 times overrun to more than 20, depending on the projects. Have been really huge. We involve sand economies in this, was not the focus, but 2% of sand size. There is another problem because they say, well, what's the cost benefit? No, we're going to spend this more. That's 3-4 times more. And they are not included in the full package, after the transference. For example, in Madeira, another absurd situation. Madeira was that's the biggest alluvial deposit with coal, called mines. You know, mining was by the water for many years in the Amazon because they were the problem, but the gold is there. So, well, I have to put this in the equation. I don't want to use it, but the gold is there, so it has a cost. There is no compensation for gold. There is nothing in the law, and I was asking for many of my colleagues here who have to work with that. We create this kind of reservoir. And we lost sand, we lost gravel, we lost gold. It's not part of the economic assessment. Well, all this is product that we can sell and the river provide. Right? So in this area, we lost the biggest areas of alluvial gold in South America, probably one of the biggest in the planet. No cost. It's not part of the cost of the dam.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It was wonderful. Can we take a few minutes before we start the next fantastic session? We'll start at 2:45.
That's fine.
I'm in charge of this.
Yeah, no, whatever's good.
There's a whole bunch of stuff. Yeah.
Guys, what they?
Oh, that's it. Yeah, exactly. It's a Venus swagger. Yes. Very awesome.
Good afternoon. Hi. So it is a pleasure to be here today. It's always a pleasure to visit my colleagues at Duke, and especially to be part of this interdisciplinary conference, and to introduce this keynote session, History of the Xingu Valley and the Place of Kuikuro People in the Global Village. We'll have two speakers, Michael Heckenberger and Afukaka Kuikuro. I'll present first Michael Heckenberger, associate professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Florida. He has published the book, The Ecology of Power, and has spent many years conducting field work and meeting with the Kuikuro people in Brazil's Xingu Valley. Today he will present Xingu Deep History and Climate Change, Research Partnerships and Sustainable Futures of Indigenous People in the 21st Century.
Good afternoon. Hopefully everybody has a little energy left after lunch. An alternative title for this is Who is the Amazon? Towards an Archaeology of the Future. This is Chief Afukaka and his daughter. Here is another person who has jumped onto the scene once again. Unfortunately, from my point of view, this is Percy Fawcett and the Lost City of Z, which has captured the imagination, unfortunately, of many people lately. That photograph that you saw, which was a photograph by Sebastião Salgado, a very famous Brazilian photographer, which he took for a photo essay in Rolling Stone magazine under this title, The Hidden Tribes of the Amazon. And right up front, it says that he documents a way of life unchanging since the dawn of time. In fact, this is a very deeply rooted image in the Western and scientific imagination about Amazonian people. Unfortunately, Rolling Stone has a much greater readership than the Ecology of Power, or even our scientific publications. I had to pull this out just to set the stage for how deeply rooted in the scientific imagination the idea that the Amazon is not only unchanging, but that it is also a natural laboratory. The land is one great, wild, untidy, luxuriant hothouse made by nature for herself. Anthropologists have also shared this, this imagery. The Handbook of South American Indians is a monumental work edited by the fairly famous American anthropologist Julian Stewart. It was a 6-volume series that broke Amazonia into not only different geographic areas, but he created this evolutionary typology that went from bands, people who lived in the Cone or in the Brazilian Cerrado tribes, the tropical forest tribe, the people who lived in the Amazon basin, chiefdoms in the Circum-Caribbean and Andean civilization. There's something that you ought to know about these volumes, however. Everything we know about those groups is from the 16th century. Everything we know about those groups is from the 19th to 20th century. And they did not incorporate in the problem of that. What happens when you look at the Amazon in the 16th century? Or how you incorporate Andean civilizations into the 20th century. But this imagery that there's a one-size-fits-all tropical forest people. Over the past couple of decades, archaeological, ethnohistorical and other information has come to the fore that shows that things are very different. Before that, the one person who argued for civilizations in the Amazon was Percy Fawcett, who went searching for and was lost in precisely the same area that we'll be talking about today, the Upper Xingu. But I want to disabuse everybody of the idea that somehow we have found what he went looking for. Percy Fawcett wouldn't have recognized a Xinguan complex society if he stumbled right over the top of it, which he did, in fact. He was looking for Atlantis in the Amazon. And so this is an unfortunate thing that once again we have to deconstruct from the Western imagination the expectation. In the current film, Brad Pitt's production, The Lost City of the Amazon, we get this imagery that somehow Percy Fawcett was promoting the idea that it was indigenous peoples that created civilization, that he learned indigenous languages, that he shared indigenous lifeways, ate indigenous foods. That is a myth. But it's unfortunately, that is the imagery that inserts itself in the popular imagination. We now know this is a early Holocene projectile point from the mouth of the Amazon. This is Jim Peterson and a project that's run by our colleague Edgardo Neves. Eduardo, Jim, and I started a project in the Central Amazon. This shows that people were in the Amazon as early as they were pretty much anywhere else in the Americas. So the idea that it waited until people had horticultural economies to occupy the Amazon is incorrect. It's also incorrect that once they established themselves, they remained at a tribal or tropical forest tribe level of development. This is from Guyana, an area that is routinely characterized as a pristine forest. This is a 3,000 to 6,000 year old mound, 200 meters by 100 meters wide, 5 meters high. It's as big as anything on the coast of Peru, in Mesoamerica or North America. Just another indication. This is, I'm giving cherry-picking a couple of examples from my own work. This is with Arawakan-speaking people on the Berbice River in Guyana. This is one of the oldest mounds in the Americas. They were doing things just as complex as everywhere in the tropical forest. These bands that you see here are what's called terra preta, or anthropogenic dark earth. So it happens very early. They have this profound impact on their environments to the point that they create these remarkable anthropogenic soils. Here's another site from the Central Amazon. Excuse me? Terra preta? Anthropogenic? It means it comes from people.
But layering is called by.
Excuse me? Layering? What's that? A little bit of background. They take the savanna sands and they stack them up, and then they pack terra preta on the top, because terra preta, or Amazonian dark earth, is very oily, very dense. And you can see how they packed it down by the way the ceramics are stacked up there. This is a construction. This is not a trash mound. This is a construction that they built up. And as you can see from the radiocarbon dates, they built it up over about 100 years. They did it very quickly. It was an intentional construction. And the point here, the takeaway point, is they had as much of an impact on their environment and were doing things as complex as anywhere else in the earth. And so the idea here that somehow the Amazon is unusual in lacking cultural development is merely a sampling problem. Okay, here is another example of anthropogenic dark earth. This is from the site of Asatuba in Manaus. It's a town that was perhaps 3 kilometers long in an area that was formerly described as lacking archaeological sites. And as recently as 1996, based on charcoal and soils collected by Muriel and Becker, argued that there was no impacts on the forest. Now we have an inventory of over 200 sites, the largest of which you see here. So again, this is just more information that things were as complex. People were doing things as remarkable and as many cultural achievements in the Amazon as elsewhere. And this is the distribution of those sites that, like I say, there's over 200. So this is what the Amazon seems to look like in the late Holocene period. Over the past 2,000 years particularly, this is the distribution we know from archaeological and ethnohistoric information, direct information that we have from the soils and actual eyewitness accounts of something that was more complicated than the tropical forest tribe, the classic model. And so here you can see why many people are starting to question that the Amazon forest is entirely natural. Now that is not to say, or at least I know no one who's arguing that the Amazon was any more anthropogenic than the medieval temperate forests of Europe, than the forests of the Congo, than the forests of temperate North America. The point is, it was no less anthropogenic. There was no less people there. Okay, this shifting gears now to the earlier about the nature, for instance, of biodiversity. This is, I threw some slides in here related to the conversation that emerged. And here I just want to point out that typically biodiversity in the Amazon is characterized by species richness and the genetic background of those species. One aspect of biodiversity that hasn't been left out of the argument is functional biodiversity. And we've talked about the arc of deforestation in the southern Amazon, the acutely sensitive nature of that area to climate change. And it also has been off the radar screen of biodiversity conservation because it is assumed that there's not great endemic biodiversity. It's not a hotspot. Well, the argument here, and what I will present through our work in the Xingu over the past 25 years, is that in terms of functional biodiversity, it's off the scales. In terms of functional biodiversity, the way that human groups, indigenous peoples in the pre-Columbian past managed their environments is as complex as anywhere else on Earth. So we might think of functional biodiversity as something interesting not only to understand, but also to conserve. And here is just a representation of how the southern Amazon has, to some degree, been left out of the equation. Here is an image of tree alpha diversity that comes from Terrasquine in 2017. And you can see that's all packed over in the western Amazon. As Paul said, that is an extremely dense species biodiversity area, not only in the Amazon, but globally. But you can see the southern Amazon kind of off the map. And so you can understand, according to this imagery, perhaps it's not a critical area in terms of conservation. What you see in the top, which is McMichael 2017, is a reconstruction and extrapolation of terra preta, or anthropogenic soil sites, along particularly the Varzea, but the major rivers of the Amazon. And once again, that seems to be focused in a particular area. One small detail about this image, for everybody who's particularly interested in these arguments, is that is a sampling question. That's where we know there are archaeological sites. But many of the areas that you do not see the red are because there's been no archaeological research there. And so we have to be very careful about that. So back to the kind of point of why we're here, why Afukaka and Takuma from the Kuikuro and I are out and about presenting arguments about the situation today and the problems that they face. And as he said, why he is here to raise consciousness about the very dire circumstances that he's involved in. Here is the reconstruction of the arc of deforestation. 2006, this is from Bertaldo Suarez Filho et al.'s article in 2006. That's where deforestation was, the arc of deforestation in 2006. This is where it's supposed to be in 2050. And you can notice that there's these green patches. Turns out those green patches, if I can just back up, are indigenous areas. This is a very critical point because it means if our interest is understanding or conserving biodiversity in the southern Amazon at all, it turns out that's isomorphic with indigenous areas. And indigenous rights and indigenous concerns in the world today. And the ones on the lower left, which we saw yesterday, are maps of 2010, 2014, 2015, which just shows the new normal for the Southern Amazon, which used to be called, when it first happened in 2005, the Centennial Drought. Now the Centennial Drought is really almost an annual thing. And so the important thing is, when Bertaldo et al. Did this simulation, the expectation is those islands were just going to stay intact because deforestation was a question of economic agro-pastoral development. Well, it turns out with climatic change and drying, in this case, the droughts, what I'll argue today is the Xingu forest, at least, is dying. Here's another example of that. This is climate analogs across the area. It just kind of paints the same image. The blue points that you see here, which I call hotspots, is these indigenous areas. But here is another graphic representation of what's happening in the Southern Amazon. This idea of not only that there is a predicted tipping point in the future, but in fact we're in a tipping event that is already going over the edge. Now here's a point that I want to make, and excuse the text here. I dragged this out of class. This is Hurricane Irma. This is the problem with simulation models. You can kind of say, well, it's going to be somewhere between there and there. My house is right smack in the middle of that red line. So this is what I presented to classes at the University of Florida last October. But the argument here is simulation models, like Bertaldo's slides, are very interesting as heuristics. But that is not necessarily a reflection of what future realities are going to be. Thinking of this in terms of climate change, let's just say the curves to the right are bad, and the curves to the left are a little better. We lose a lot of forest on the right, we lose less forest on the left. How do we change that dynamic? What kinds of activities, even small-scale activities, can potentially then repercuss and alter the imagery that Bertaldo's slides and others have presented us with? And they're not the only ones. This is the first person who I ran into that mentions the Southern Amazon as a tipping point is an article by Dan Dept et al., where he refers to the Southern Amazon as a near-term tipping point. And actually, in the upper right, the figure from his article, he scales it back quite a bit. He's saying that's what it's going to look like in 2030, or in other words, in a decade. Now, I put this one up here to build on a point that came up in a discussion with Yvonne about biological and biodiversity sampling. This is a sample of forest inventory plots across the Amazon. There's two areas that are kind of notably out of it. And when you look over to the left at where indigenous areas are, turns out there's some correspondence with that. In fact, the study that Dept et al. Did was done right at the very edge of the Xingu indigenous park and didn't include the indigenous areas adjacent to it. That's treated as pristine tropical forest that then is having the effect of climate change. And I'll show you a photograph of the forests that they were dealing with are not natural forests, they're heritage forests. They're essentially 100% anthropogenic. And it's very important not only to understand the nature of those forests, but also to understand their resiliency and how they've been changed. And in some instances, it seems like they were changed as indigenous groups in the pre-Columbian past adapted to climatic change in the past. Okay, we talked about phylogenies in biological sense. This is a culture historical map on one level of the primary indigenous groups in the Southern Amazon. These are all related to one language family, the Arawak language family, who it turns out, against the panorama of all Amazonian indigenous people, the Arawak-speaking peoples are the ones most likely to build earthworks, to live in settled villages, to have complex and semi-intensive economic systems. It's a very closely related group of people. I'm going to be talking particularly about these areas over to the right here. But the point here, the Xingu and the Patassi, some of you may have seen that area, the Patassi area, with the P there. There was an article that appeared in Nature, was it 2 weeks ago, which just showed because of deforestation, they now have 80-some odd earthwork sites. You're all probably familiar with over there, A is Acre. That's an Arawak-speaking area that is occupied by the Pudana. There's now 400 geoglyph sites that are recognized there. So you can see why. We know very clearly that the Mohos, the Majinideos, Acre, now the Patassi, and the Xingu are heavily occupied areas. It seems like in each one of those regional societies, there was something on the order of 100,000 or more people, which is why the folks who wrote the article about the earthworks in the Upper Tapajos region argue that the population of the southern Amazon at the time of European contact was over 1 million people. I absolutely agree with that based on the work we've done in the Xingu. Here's a distribution of those earthworks. This is from Charles Mann's science news story that came out when we published the article on pre-Columbian urbanism or garden cities in 2008. So now we know, because of that fresh article, that that area in the intervening area is also characterized by these really quite remarkable and complex earthworks. Here's just looking at those two areas on the map. They're very interesting because the Arawakan groups mapped right onto the forest areas. You do not find them. In the Upper Xingu, for instance, the distribution of that cultural pattern, which in the Upper Xingu, it merged with Carib-speaking people who already lived there and created a regional culture. That is almost one-to-one correspondence with the distribution of the forest. These Arawakan-speaking people were forest peoples. They survived based on forest agriculture and fishing all across this range. And I'll get back to that now, how we're in a situation at the moment where people who have depended for the past 2,000 years on their forest economies may not have forests very soon. And so what does that mean? And more importantly, for us, what can we do to help? Here is the only ethnohistoric reference to the Upper Tapajos area. The people existed in such vast quantity, it's not possible to count their settlements. Many times in one day's march, one passes 10 or 12 villages, and in each one, there are from 10 to 30 houses. Even the roads, they make very straight and wide, and they keep them so clean that one will not even find a fallen leaf. This is the only eyewitness report. It comes from 1720 of the Patassi region. There's no equivalent report in the Upper Xingu. That was only reported in the 1880s. But we do have archaeological information. These are GPS using high resolution satellite real-time GPS from 2003. Of what you see in red are roads. Very familiar. Straight, wide, you wouldn't even find a fallen leaf. So you can see they're very much sister cultures which had the same thing. The Upper Xingu is also notable because when you talk about the impact of agricultural development and climate change in the arc of deforestation, we all know that's a bad area. It's getting hit very hard as anywhere else on the planet. Well, the hardest hit area is right where they live, right where Afukaka and his people live. I started working with them in 1992. You can see the deforestation. This is an image from the Instituto Socioambiental in Sao Paulo. And here it is in 2005. As you know, was discussed, Victor mentioned, there's been good success in reducing the rate of deforestation. So 2005 is the peak. But one thing I can tell you is they haven't reforested any of this area out of the indigenous part. So here's the indigenous part, little island of forest. Xingu is a very neat little basin. What happens when you take all the forest around the edge of the basin dries out. That's what we're seeing now. In terms of forested basin, there's a strong possibility that, as Dan said, predicted, in 2030, not going to be forested anymore. Here is the distribution of the indigenous people. You can see where the Kuikuro live right here. That's our study area where we've been working on mapping their cultural heritage sites from the present day back as far in time. We have their people registered back to at least 1,500, more likely 2,000 years ago. We work also with linguist Bruce Furtado and an ethnographer, Carlos at the National Museum, to do documentation basically in the service of the Kuikuro Indigenous Association that Xingu created about 15 years ago. Okay, here is the Upper Xingu Basin 500 years ago, where we see one Kuikuro village today. There was 2 clusters of village. They were 2 of about 35 clusters of communities. These are the so-called garden cities. And this is what I mean by a garden city. A young and strapping Kuikuro could run from one site to another in about 10 minutes. These are not independent sites. You can see by their layout, they represent regional planning. They're more like neighborhoods in a community. But rather than packing everybody into an individual town that even the likes of Percy Fawcett would recognize as a city, they did it differently. They did it in these multi-centric systems. But look at the knowledge that is packed into there. There's every usable, here's a protractor in this ceremonial site. You have north, south, east, west, intercardinal, solstice angles, all built right in there. And if you don't have the solstice angles at the ceremonial central site, you pick it up in the large 50-hectare walled town just to the north of it. An interesting thing came up when we just kind of connected the dots. It's like, wow, the center is like not right over the top of the site. Well, that didn't get by them either. They put a plaza right where that center point was. This is not Stone Age savages frozen at the dawn of time. We're not looking at people who continued the practices way back to the origin of initial Amazonian people. This is not tropical forest culture. This is something radically different and more sophisticated. Here is, we collected about 5,000 surface collection units across the surface of the site, because you can build a big wall, but that doesn't mean that people lived across it. So to understand how big were these actual communities, we collected 6,000 surface collection, 25 kilometers worth of transects, just like we mapped about 40 kilometers of these roadways. Very labor intensive, it really takes decades, and takes a tremendous contribution by trained Kuikuro participants. None of this work would have been possible without them. But you can see these entire sites are occupied. These are 250-hectare sites. So this shows that not only are they a lot bigger, not only are the roads a lot wider, not only are there plans, really a remarkable achievement in urban design, urban planning. We're talking about 500 years ago. And at 500 years ago, if you plopped yourself down in the middle of medieval Europe, you'd find nothing as sophisticated in terms of regional planning as these systems. You'd find really elaborate towns which had some spectacular stone architecture. But in terms of regional planning and integration, this is the textbook case for our textbook in the development of world civilization. 500 years ago, this was one of the most sophisticated mechanisms for that. How do we know certain things like this? Here we are mapping with the high-resolution GPS. As probably all of you know, in 2001, when we started doing this mapping, the federal government turned off selective availability, so you could actually get some halfway decent GPS measurements. I bought a GPS unit in 1993. You can kind of tell which municipality the site was in, but it was really, you couldn't do archaeological mapping. All of a sudden in 2001, we could map in 2 days sites that took me about 3 months to map by cutting those transects through the forest, which was very labor intensive. We also did excavations on the walls are defined by these moats. And these are very, they give us very refined chronology. You can understand, for instance, you can see the red natural soil that they threw up on top. So we can mark exactly when those earthworks were constructed. There's remarkable consistency. 1250 of the Christian era, boom, 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 boom. These earthworks went up. They restructured the entire system. This was an intentionally planned intervention into landscape, which is quite a remarkable thing. Just another example of this. This is from another site, an aerial photograph. You can just barely see in that clearing there this exact same pattern. And so you can see these cluster organizations go across the basin. Here's a reconstruction of what one of those towns might look like. Now, I got into it with the folks at Scientific American about this. I said, look, when you look at the contemporary village, look at how big the houses are in comparison to the plaza. Says, don't they seem a little bit big in the reconstruction? Shouldn't there be more like 80 or 100 of them, which is what we suggest based on the ceramic distributions and the scale of the things. Likewise, that's a 40-meter wide road. So that would be a very tall individual walking down that. And those canoes are bigger. But they said, well, listen, our readership, we need to see humans. We need to see the houses in a recognizable form. But just so you all know, there's 4 times as many houses in that. So yes, you might think of it as a big village. I prefer to think of it as a town because the villages, like you see the one to the left, also existed in the system, but really what we call them is not critically important. Also this is Chief Afukaka at a younger age, me at a younger age as well. This is one of their primary rituals that they hold in the plaza. These are important things. Plazas in the past, plazas in the present. These mechanisms or these indicators of cultural continuity, to be able to make arguments about what changed or what stayed the same between the present and the past, we need archaeological and ethnographic information that we can directly compare. One aspect of continuity in Xingu societies is the layout of their communities. And by extension, the ethno-mathematical or ethno-engineering systems that constructed those multi-community settlements in the past. Ceramics is another thing we can find. When I found those ceramics in an archaeological site, I actually handed them over to a contemporary ceramic maker and just asked a simple question. Who made these? And it was not uncommon that I was looked at like, wow, you're really like a 6-year-old, aren't you? How should I know? It could have been her, could have been her. It never entered into that person's mind that this was igiho, which is the ceramics from divine origin in the archaeological sites. So I'm not the only one that sees this really profound continuity in the ceramics through time. Now that's important. Why? Well, it's important, for instance, because you can see that little notch there. That's a notch they make in contemporary pots to put a stage through which they process manioc. It's a mechanism where we can reconstruct that they were eating the same types of foods. And since the ceramics are functionally very specifically related to economic practices such as manioc production or processing of key fruit, we can argue, well, if there's 70% of that type of pot in contemporary time and 77% of that pot in the pre-Columbian villages, there's continuity in their basic economy. They weren't growing something else, they didn't depend on something else. Absolutely remarkable continuity. Also remarkable continuity in their fishing systems. These are people who eat almost entirely fish. The idea that there's protein limitations in the Amazon does not work for these people. They depend on fish. And Kalervo Oberg, an anthropologist who worked both in the Xingu and in the northwest coast of America, said the fishing resources in the Xingu were richer than the resources in the northwest coast. They have plentiful food. That actually is an artificially modified pond. It's got a big earthen dam that's pre-Columbian in orientation. And this woman is using a kundu trap. I went out for a ritual fishing trip with about 10 Kuikuro. There was 5 of those traps. They worked for about 4 hours, and they pulled 150 kilos of armored catfish out of that pond. So the resources are really quite abundant. Also, house construction, house form. Now, obviously, you're not going to find the thatch. Grass and thatch is an industrial resource that hasn't entered into the arguments about what people were using in their anthropogenic landscapes, but it was absolutely critically important here. But we can talk about the form of the villages themselves. Here we excavated a house, and I asked the team to go down 5 centimeters. We didn't see much. Down another 5 centimeters. Then I had one of the graduate students came up and said, well, you know, it's not a really grass use. We don't think this is a house. We think we should move on. And I said, listen, do the old man a favor, 5 more centimeters. And we found right there an undagi. Undagi is a ceramic support. That's a very specific ceramic thing. When our Kuikuro team saw that undagi, they had the whole house mapped out. So, oh yeah, here's the kitchen. That's going to be the door. That's going to be a sleeping area. We excavated it. Sure enough, that's what it looked like. Exactly the same size as the average house today. These are important things to build the scaffolding to try and compare contemporary people with past people. This is the scientific information that we depend on. It's also tied to the way that the Kuikuro orient themselves in the landscape. When you enter into a house, the person that owns the house lives parallel to the main axis of the house to the right. They're called the une otu. When you enter into a village on the formal path, the Tanguinho, on the right is the primary chief, the Etioto. And these exact same ethno-mathematics is obviously what underlay these complex systems in the pre-Columbian past. Here is just some of the GIS. We're doing GIS workshops now to do co-produced maps with the Kuikuro Indigenous Association. We've got a few million GPS points that we've got to crunch down into usable maps to produce this kind of thing. But here is one of the interesting things about how, well, let me give you this slide first. Here is that was the northern cluster that we were looking at. We didn't have the southern cluster fully mapped at that time. We do now. It turns out it was identical. So this idea that somebody goes out into the forest and just because it's alongside a lake, they just build a clearing in the forest and open up. No. If there was an analog for downtown Manhattan in the pre-Columbian world, this is it. They had everything oriented to the same proportions, the same angles. And one of the interesting things here is the 2 primary residential sites. The little one in white in the middle is the ceremonial site. And then the 2 primary walled towns, which about 40, 50 hectares, are connected by a land road. And those are big roads, as I said. They get up to about 40, 50 meters wide. In other words, a 4-lane highway. But the secondary centers, it's about 20, 30 hectares, they always put them across a river, which is interesting. It's almost like they're kind of weaving the different elements of the landscape into the system. And so this is this kind of socio-ecological connectivity. This is a remarkable thing. In terms of networks and connectivity and integration in regional planning, this really is truly remarkable stuff. But you see what starts to appear just above X45, which is one of our archaeological site numbers. See those? They look like terraces. They're not terraces. They're bands in the forest. They're anthropogenic bands in the forest. It took us a while to find that. They just started to appear in 2009. And between 2009, they appear more and more and more. What do they reflect? We're going to jump ahead a little bit to here. What do they reflect? Well, what are we seeing in these bands? This is forest die-off. If this was the result of deciduous trees dropping their leaves in the lighter bands, we would have seen it in all the satellite images we were studying for years up until 2009. There is nothing in the imagery before 2009 that reflects this. In 2009, we get the first gas. By 2013, when Landsat 8 goes up, they are very, very clear, and you can pick them up. Now, they're almost all over the place. This is the dieback of existing forest. Let me back up now to this point here. Not only were they managing forests, and I'll go back to the banded forests and show you some new sexy stuff that we've come up with over the past year about those. Not only were they managing the forest, but their wetland management systems were absolutely remarkable. This is a reconstruction from the Beni, from the Baudes area in the Guapore drainage from Bolivia. Same kind of thing is going on in the upper Xingu. In that particular stream that you see here, you can see big ponds, which are like hatchery management areas, then the fish weirs in those yellow areas, big tanks. This big black pond that you see there, in contemporary times, if you pass by there in a motorboat, they will say, take the side channel. Why? Because there's a big spirit being there. There's ideological constraints of using those. They're fish preserves. Or in fisheries biology, they're hatcheries. And then the fish weirs are in the downstream portion of them. These are more like aquariums, fishery management systems, than they are natural streams. And in recent times, because of massive forest fires that have occurred in 2016 and 2017 that have taken almost out, or they've affected almost half of the Kuikuro's tropical forest, we started to all of a sudden see, you see those straight bands there? These are fish ponds too, even at a much, much larger scale. Now, we didn't see these before because this is a wetland that seasonally dries out. When it dried out last year, it burned. The whole area burned. And so all that brown is where the burning happened. And so there was vegetation, higher vegetation that covered these things up. And this year, all of a sudden they appeared. This is, again, just a remarkable degree of landscape management done by the ancestors of the Kuikuro. Here's just some more images of these forest bands. There's been banded vegetation recognized in semi-arid and arid environments in a few places across the globe related to drier climates in natural phenomena. It's never been recognized in a tropical forest environment. And where it happens is absolutely critical. Sorry, I got to slide out of sequence. I'll get back to where they happen and why we believe there's certainly anthropogenic features. Also, their form. It's hard to get these features. Here is the higher bands and the lower bands. You can pick them up as they come into as they come into this eroded area of the landscape. Not only their form, but you can see how they crisscross, and actually they go against what topography would do. If these were top topographic forms, you would expect them to be smaller at the height of the topographic form, right? The high ground is right in the middle there, but they do the opposite. They're small by the river, and then they grow up the hill. You can also see the crossing. This is one of those forest fires, by the way. The darker coloration in this panchromatic image is actually forest fires, and you can see how the fires shoot up the bands. These bands were probably strip farming. They were using the lighter bands to farm. And when I say farm, as often as not, it's not agricultural plants or subsistence crops, it's industrial plants, it's trees and tree management. The estimation of the need for a single type of tree, Schelopia brasiliensis, Pindaíba in Brazil, the demand for that, because it's the singular tree, they only use that tree to build their houses, was about 200,000 saplings that were required to meet the need of one of those clusters for, let's say, a 10-year period. There was a massive need. Those saplings grow best, guess where? In edges. This system of management, if it is such, increased the edge area of the forest exponentially. They all of a sudden had tremendous resources. It's also a fire control mechanism, as we can see with the contemporary fires. If in a drier climatic period, the soils dry out, which we know they naturally do, we're seeing that today, and forest fire is a threat. When a forest fire goes into a forest like this, it'll shoot down those bands, which are burned by the people as well to enrich the soils and to clear areas. And so this may be a fire control mechanism. Just like the wide 40 to 50 meter roads may be a forest control mechanism. I didn't think about this. I talked, I remember, a few years back with Dan Nesbitt about the fact that around the towns, there are trees that survive fires very well through contemporary human use. They're fire-adapted landscapes in a way. But I never thought that forest fires, like we've seen over the past 2 years, would affect them. This has never happened before. Afukaka mentioned when he describes this that there's never been that kind of a forest fire. Forest fires that go into full stand tropical forest, that is, that's a couple thousand hectares of forest right here in a single burn. And so it seemed like perhaps some of their ancestors were adapted to precisely the same kinds of things.
You say that they
No, there's absolutely no indication on the ground that there's any elevational difference. What I think was happening was they were, rather than agglutinated open areas, they would put their open houses, their gardens, in a strip pattern, and they kind of do it back and forth along the strips. It's just a minor modification of the way that they use the land today. They deforest today very differently. Metal axes and more lately, more recently, chainsaws have radically changed the way that they practice their manioc agriculture. We know they were growing manioc and piquet and these other basic staple resources of today 500 years ago. But that's not to say that they were doing it the same way. And anybody who's trying to do anything with a stone tool knows that it's a lot of work to have to have full stand tropical forest. And so it makes sense, rather than just kind of opening a clearing in full forest and then opening clearings alongside it, letting the forest come up to full forest, you're managing much more intensively or semi-intensively the secondary growth. This is the distribution of those banded features across the Upper Xingu today. And it maps almost completely over the distribution of archaeological sites, including, notice this area here, where we actually do have pretty good information, but no archaeological sites. And sure enough, in that same area, we have, it's actually over beyond that series of orange banded forest there. No banded forest. They're identical ecological settings. They're undergoing the same process of desiccation that we see there. And this is why it seems like in this portion of the world, it's very difficult to put your finger anywhere and say, boy, there's where the natural forest is. This is a saturated anthropogenic landscape. And it's not unusual. We're starting to find the same evidence of extremely densely concentrated earthworks in the upper Tapajos. We know that the Bolivian Mojos is just a playground of pre-Columbian earthworks, and also in Rock Grave, they found over 400 of these things. This is the distribution of these banded forests across the entire Xingu. That was our estimation of the distribution of anthropogenic impacts in 2008. It's increased a little bit more, but one of the interesting things, again, to note is that they don't happen anywhere. There's groupings. Just like today, the cultural groups, the Upper Xingu is a multicultural system, have kind of buffer zones between different groups. The other interesting thing is they appear right at the edge of the basin. Not in large amounts, but it's almost as if they were put at the edge of the forested basin. Now, is that a reflection of boundary maintenance, a cultural boundary? Is it something that related to relations with non-Xinguang people? Or was it something that was once again an adaptation to the acute sensitivity of this environment to climate change? Now, we know this is a lake bottom core that we did, which the portion that you see here, which is preliminary information. Here is where I should point out that in my work over the years with natural scientists, I've come into these interesting moments where one person says one thing and another person says another based on the same information, which adds a little bit of a question mark. Interesting as a heuristic device, but the two paleontologists who were working on this, one says, that's good data, the other says, no, it's not testable data. It is a wonderful heuristic tool for the following reason. We have a radiocarbon date. As an archaeologist, I'm a believer in radiocarbon dates. That's the part I did. Right at the very base of that profile of 5,000 years ago. Mid-Holocene warm period, or mid-Holocene climatic anomaly, or mid-Holocene optimum. I've always wondered what that word optimum means. Optimum for whom, anthropologists would ask. But at any rate, 5,000 years ago, you see the grasses on one side, the trees on the other. We don't exactly know why, but there's a possibility that the Upper Xingu was Cerrado 5,000 years ago, in the warmest period before the contemporary time. And then trees started to expand in the region. The interesting thing for me is during the second warmest period, the medieval warm anomaly, trees continued to expand. There's a possibility that because humans actually were managing the system in a way that buffered the effects of the climate change. That's a hypothesis. But it's an interesting hypothesis to chase down because all of a sudden it suggests that maybe pre-Columbian people have answers to problems like how do we try and avoid losing the forest in the Xingu today? How do we do so in a way that's meaningful for the indigenous people there? And there's just the kind of the general model of what that looks like. Look at 1200 as kind of the peak of the medieval warming period. Here's another. Now, why do I say 1200? Remember, all of those earthworks, that regional integration, and by extension, the banded forests that conform to exactly the same configuration as those appear at 1250. They're right at the end of what appears to be a particularly dry area. Is it possible that Amazonian indigenous people were so together that they actually were doing things in a way that would be an improvement to how we work and live in those forested regions today? Could they provide answers, solutions to contemporary climate change? Make no mistake, the appearance of those banded forests, the forest fires that exposed all of this archaeology to us, are happening for one very clear reason. Dan Nexted was right. This is not a tipping point. This is a tipping event. They're already tipping. The forest is dying. We have clear evidence. It's differentially dying, but it is dying. There's less forest today than there was last year, less last year than the year before. This is a reality. It's happening. And it seems like it probably will continue to happen. And so understanding those banded forests, which have also become a galvanizing point for our interactions and partnerships with them in understanding their cultural heritage, it kind of motivates to think, well, our ancestors had mechanisms, they did things to address problems that they're facing right now. Now, whether or not the hypotheses that I've suggested here about those features, how they were constructed, what they represent, what they possibly mean for adapting to things like climate change, well, that's one thing. The fact that they have sparked tremendous interest and partnership in looking at these questions with the indigenous people, that has tremendous potential in and of itself to draw people together into conversations, into dialogues, to deal with common problems. Indigenous people almost invariably are treated as part of the problem, part of a human rights problem, part of a, we heard in Alex's talk, protected areas. They're part of this equation that it's like, well, we have to respect indigenous rights, but they really don't understand science. They really do not operate in the same world that we do. They're not part of the solution. I think we need to change that equation. I think we need to recognize that indigenous forms of knowledge combined with contemporary science provide the best solutions. And in fact, in the southern Amazon, because remember, the only standing forest happens to be standing in their indigenous areas, it's not a choice of whether to work with indigenous people. It's an imperative. And so it is a question of translation. How do we communicate with them? How do we stimulate mutual interest in common problems? And then how do we build on that? And I think I'm going to leave it there because I've probably already gone on longer than I should. And we really need to get to the main show, which is my brother, Chief Edgardo. But I'm happy to have a few questions. Yes, sir.
Why such wide, straight roads 500 years ago?
That's a question I've been asking myself for years. And now that I've seen the effect of forest fires in the region, I all of a sudden think, boy, what a great fire control mechanism. Build big, wide, sandy roads, and it will stop those forests in their tracks. I was absolutely amazed when I learned about what forest firefighters do in the western United States with forest fires. And there's little ditches, and there's little undulations on the landscape. There's burning off certain areas, which they're doing today. Takamas film Eco, which means fire, talks specifically to what they're trying to do to adapt to forest fires. But make no mistake, Kuikuro, half of their forested lands have burned in the past few years. It's a massive threat. And so if, for instance, at the time that these large interventions, these changes that unified or integrated the communities, and they widened the roads, and they built them between people, if that has anything to do whatsoever with the fact that's the warmest time in the past 3,000 years, well, maybe they also had a problem with forest fires. And so those wide roads, and we don't know for certain, but it does not seem that that system of integration, those very big villages with walls around them, and those really wide roads happened before 1250. There was certainly connectivity between communities, but they expanded the communities. They built very large infrastructure around them, those walls. The ditches associated with walls around communities are very base of them, they all have a funnel. And you can see different decompositional kind of things. You can see organics in those funnel portions. They're associated with palisade walls. Maybe the palisade walls were as much about the control of fire, because they use fire. What is the source of the fires that expand into forest fires today? It's the fact that they use fires to prepare agricultural areas. They set fires to things. It's just they haven't gotten out of control in the past. So maybe the same fires that they use in their economic systems today got out of control at a certain point in the past. And so these may in fact be fire control mechanisms. I never thought about that before the past two years, before these fires came into play. But that may be the reason why not only these folks, but the people who live hundreds of kilometers to the west, which they just found the earthworks that are right over that area where I read you the quote from 1720, roads wide and straight, and not even fallen leaf can be found. Perhaps it's not just a cultural aesthetic. Perhaps there actually was very sophisticated ecological management going on in the system. Yes, come on.
2 questions. Are the Kuikuro special when it comes to landscape management? Also, why is there such a huge concentration of cultural diversity?
Well, we know historically the history of this. Across the southern Amazon, the entire ecological zone known as the Southern Transitional Forest. It's not just a transition between the Cerrado and the broadleaf evergreen forest. It's a unique ecological area. And one of the reasons it's so unique is because everywhere you find Southern Transitional Forest, you can find earthworks under it. It's largely anthropogenic. And so we didn't know about the Anthropology until about 2 weeks ago. We suspected it based on Peter's Conco's 1720, but we didn't know it for certain. But we now have it in the forested Upper Xingu Basin, in the forested Upper Tapajos Basin, in the Guaporé Basin, in the Upper Purus, the Madre. And so these patterns are found across there. Same things. Major village earthworks, big straight roads, complex systems of wetland management, and the suggestion that they were using semi-intensive farming practices. And so the Xingu, we have a better ability. Not only do we have more comprehensive mapping, but we have the ability to tie that to the living indigenous people themselves. But the forests themselves reveal something. The reason we know there's so many earthworks in Acre is because of deforestation. The reason they found the earthworks in the Anthropology is because these are deforested areas. In Xingu, we're actually seeing things in the forest itself. And so it's not because the forest was cut down, it's changes that we see in the forest itself, which seem to indicate a little bit better the types of management systems that they had. And in terms of the multicultural nature of the Upper Xingu, we know that whole suite of Southern Amazonian societies are tied to the movement of Arawak-speaking people, the colonization of Arawak-speaking people, about maybe 2,500, 2,000 years ago across the Southern Amazon. Already in the Upper Xingu existed the ancestors of the Caribbean, the Carib-speaking people. Afukaka speaks a Carib language. They went into an ethnogenetic moment and adopted the same cultural practices. So in other words, the Caribs adopted the circular plazas, the earthworking systems, the settled maniac agricultural economies. And in some places it wasn't just maniac. There's very good evidence coming out of Acre and Mongolia of domesticated rice or native rice being used 4,000 years ago, corn as well. In the Xingu, it's primarily maniac. And then what happens is, as the Portuguese and later Brazilian colonial front kind of puts the stranglehold, what people have called the embrace of death, because of the contemporary agro-pastoral development. That's a process that went over a few hundred years, and it forced a whole bunch of other indigenous people into the area. But we know from their oral histories exactly when that happened. In 1500, it was the Carib and Arawak-speaking people, and other people came in. And the roots of these complex technologies are related to those Arawak-speaking people of the West.
We suggest we have Afukaka's talk.
Yes, absolutely.
Q&A.
No, I think that's very good.
Thank you so much for the brilliant presentation. And I would like to introduce now, it's actually a great honor to have Afukaka Kuikuro, who is the Paramount chief of the Kuikuro Nation. And Afukaka Kuikuro is also, as it's never enough to stress, and Professor Heckenberger has expressed it, how the collaboration of the Kuikuro people was crucial to the development of this research. Afukaka Kuikuro is going to present in Kuikuro language, and Takuman Kuikuro, who is a filmmaker and the president of the Kuikuro Indigenous Association, is going to translate this speech to Portuguese, and then Gustavo is going to translate to English. So we have a voting.
Obrigado. Eu vou falar a minha língua.
Thank you. I'll speak my language.
Mike speak. Because we have to get in the Xingu. Then again, tem essa Xingu again. Não tem assim, não tem, não. Só plano. Xingu. Não tem. É terrível. É, final tudo. Estrada de Pedreira. Cacique Raulzinho. E tu é de Pedreira. O cacique Raulzinho que usa portátil. E tu é de.
Então, ele falou que o Mike, ele explicou o trabalho dele sobre o povo indígena do Xingu. Ele falou sobre a terra indígena do Xingu e ele falou assim, na terra indígena não tem morro, não tem tudo plano, não tem aquele tipo uma morro lá, uma montanha, tudo o campo. Para lá em cima, uma terra indígena Caiapó, onde Raul mora. Isso que ele falou.
So Michael explained to you about the Xingu territory and the Xingu Park. And this is the place where we live. And in this place, there are no mountains or hills. It is all flat. They're plains. To the north, where the Kayapó live, then you have to the north, there the Kayapó.
Lá tem gueta. Já é marcado ganhou muito jeito. Bacia do Culuene, intensito. Kuikuro, Carvalho, Matipu, Mafuá, Camará, Iolapiti, Uaurá, Meinato, Aruiti, Ipé, Cauaiveté, Juruna, Gay Trepaque, esse coisa de Gay. e sede, Siuiá, na água do guia. Então, eu dei tudo de pé, eu dei tudo de pé, eu dei tudo de pé. Só já dei tá.
Ele falou, aqui o povo são Carvalho, né? Matipu, Nafuá, Camará, Jawapiti, Suriá, Paurá, Iquipeng, Peinaco, aquele pedacinho ali, uma terra indígena Uauí, onde o povo Quinceiro mora, aquele pedacinho. O que vocês estão vendo aqui, imagem, tudo em vermelho, tudo desmatamento, onde nosso território de Xingu é uma ilha. E realmente vocês estão olhando aqui, realmente, onde está sendo plantada soja, só tem a soja aqui em vermelho aqui. Por isso que eu mesmo, preocupando com o bacia do Xingu, né? Onde a nascente do rio é onde está sendo jogado agrotóxico e isso está caindo na terra indígena.
So he lists all the indigenous peoples who live in this land. You heard the names of the people, right? The Bang. I won't repeat all the names. And he points out that around this indigenous land, the places in red are where you have the big plantations of soy that are surrounding that territory. And what concerns him the most is the source of the water of the Xingu River and the effect of these plantations around that territory.
Isso, mudança climática, né? Dentro de uma hospital, Xingu é para lá, Xingu. Pelo monte para lá. Xingu é Culuene. Daí de barragem, uma que eu estava tendo. A Petra, lá tem o resultado, é uma coisa, não é? 이게 유불있지 아직 온데바 위트네 유불있지 saída fora do área é o município de Gaúcha do Norte. Lá onde vai crescer aqui no Marque, né? Uma caetinha o pé e o trabalho também com o pé. Ainda é lugar, está tudo, lagoa, saída lá no fora. Você viu lá, o Pinha, o Inhaonha, o Tigi Puganha, o teu resto.
Então, ele falou que esse Xingu tem esse rio lá, o rio desce aqui, a gente chama ele do lado de Alto Xingu, por causa do rio, né? Rio descendo para lá e pelo norte, lá tem hidrelétrica pelo monte. Do lado de cá também, aqui, onde a gente mora, tem também hidrelétrica, pequena hidrelétrica. E isso que está dando problema para a gente, nossa preocupação com mudança climática, porque está tendo muito assoreamento pelo rio. Tem esse rio Xingu, a gente não tem como proteger ele, porque ele é muito difícil porque está tendo muito lá barragem e outro lado barragem. Isso está secando cada vez mais. Tem rio Buritiba, onde a gente pertence, nossa aldeia, que realmente eu pedi para o Mike, aonde a gente pode procurar nossa ajuda, filtrar aquilo realmente, aquele rio onde está sendo jogado agrotóxico. Realmente a gente está tentando procurar ajuda e para a gente, pelo menos, ter esse rio. E outro também, o lagoa, que está fundo, tem fora da terra indígena, a gente tem que fazer isso, filtrar também aquele rio. Porque não é realmente para mim que eu estou preocupando, eu falo para ficar futuro, geração em geração. Porque daqui um dia eu não vou estar nesse lugar, porque meus netos vão viver. Como é que eles vão viver daqui futuramente? Isso é a minha preocupação sobre essa água, essa terra que cada vez mais está ficando seco e poluído pelos brasileiros.
So my concern with the change in the climate also includes the hydroelectric plants that are formed in the south and the north, like Belo Monte, which is the better known case, that are changing also the rivers and affecting the rivers upon which we depend. We have also talked about the idea of finding ways to purify the water from all the poison that comes to the rivers from the monocultural plantations. And we're discussing that with Michael about ways to clean the water so that we can have those waters again. My concern, yes, is not with myself, but with the future of our children, our grandchildren, the future of our people who depend on those waters.
Então, grazie. Dai, grazie, questo che gratta. Si tu ta qui ci cuccia. Dai, ci cosa da grazie, questo che gare. Ma che da cazzo grande che tu. Bugoia, mio che ci sono. E te petto in te. Dai, veni a ta gagna ne te cazzo da te. Ngo bugote patsege la tuate tahununute chatruga digada itukugada chatu yotukugada chimukitami yode tukitami lehde yode pois é isso.
Então, ele falou, então é isso, é a minha preocupação que eu estou falando, mostrando para vocês. O Mike mostrou seu trabalho sobre aldeias antigos que foi construído em 1500 anos atrás, e foi construído realmente como era que ele mostrou, né? E esse é nosso lugar, isso é nosso território realmente que a gente está vivendo hoje em dia. Eu quero que ele continue também fazendo esse trabalho, até que ele pesquisa mais as coisas que estão faltando, e esse ano ele vai trabalhar lá com a gente mais, e ele vai mapeando tudo que a gente tem na história, para ficar tudo registrado, para não perder essa nossa memória, nossas aldeias, nossa história, através do trabalho dele. Então é isso que ele falou.
So I'm sharing with you my concerns. This is our territory. Michael has shown to you how our people used to live 1,500 years ago, and we want him to continue to do this work so that we can remember our past, remember our history, and continue to understand how we lived and continue to live today. In free translation, actually.
Só isso mesmo. Só isso, muito obrigado.
Should we have him stay up for
And
questions?
and we can have questions for either Afukaka or Michael.
This was a conclusion. What we can do in Canada legally, we demonstrate the impact on the Indian territory, all these activities. We can come up with and combine result, and well, all this is producing a deterioration and lots of, we demonstrate the impacts. There is some legal action that we can.
I'm not sure of the legality. That's out of my area of specialization with the specific legal things are. I can say that there's a lot of laws that are followed badly oftentimes. And so I'm not so sure that it's in the area of kind of legal recourse that is the most productive way to see solutions. I really think that the most critical thing that can happen now is to develop partnerships. You saw in that last slide that was just sitting up there, the absolute correspondence between indigenous areas and standing forests. And so the question is, in those indigenous areas, how do we develop the knowledge about what those systems are, what the biodiversity is, what biodiversity, both the scientific and indigenous terms, is, what the cultural heritage of those places are. One take-home message out of all of this is, don't go into any portion of the southern transitional forests with the assumption that you're studying natural forests. That's not to say it doesn't exist, but everywhere we look, if you find a potsherd under the forest, it's not fully natural. That's just a fact, and we just seem to keep finding potsherds. So we have to understand it as anthropogenic forest. And anthropogenic forest has different parameters of resiliency and how it potentially can be used. We need to monitor these systems. And I've worked with a lot of scientists over the years, and there's a few very special friends who actually live in the Amazon and are out there quite a bit. But oftentimes it's 2 weeks here, a month there, and then back to wherever. The indigenous people live there. They're committed. Training them to understand our techniques of mapping, of scientific inquiry, of experimentation, different practices that potentially have an impact. There's a lot of indigenous people, and they're very motivated to do mapping, to do, as Victor said in his talk, you make it meaningful to them, and you create solutions in ways that are important to them. That, I think, is more important. How do we build bridges? It was brought up when we were talking about the tipping zone, the question of stopping the bad things that are happening in the Amazon. In this part of the Amazon, other than the registered indigenous reserves themselves, anybody who flies over the region, it's not there anymore. There just isn't forest, really. There's small patches here and here. There was a sensibility that by creating these patches, which was to some degree a quasi-legal mechanism for a trade-off between deforestation from ranching, and you leave a patch here, you leave a patch here, you leave a little corridor. Well, that does not have any impact whatsoever on regional scale changes, such as the desiccation of the entire Xingu Basin. When you removed enough of the forest around the edges, it dries up, and just what we're seeing now in the indigenous part, which is a very basic basin, is the fine drying of that. We're not going to turn that tide by trying to convince the ranchers or the multinational agricultural or agricultural companies or government agencies to intervene with legal recourse. It's more motivating training and developing partnerships, I think, with the local peoples themselves, and empowering them to start to do things to protect their lands, to try and ameliorate. This is why there was the slide of Hurricane Irma. I'm a believer, as you mentioned, that not everything has to be pessimistic, and that actually we can affect positive change. And so what is it that we can do today to work together with them to try and, okay, we know that it's going in this direction. It's not going to be good over the next 10 to 20 years, at least in the southern Amazon. I don't think Rinaldo Suarez or Dan Epstead or Carlos Nobre and Tom Lovejoy are wrong when they say we're headed into a tipping zone. Now the question is what's the best case and what's the worst case within those changes that are happening. And there, I think we can really kind of exercise in partnerships with Indigenous people mechanisms to be optimistic and try and change that. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, can you say more about his culture, his community, how it's faring, what they're doing? Just kind of more sociological conversation that's in the community.
Ela está perguntando se pode comentar mais sobre a sua comunidade, sobre o Kuikuro, como que é a vida de vocês. Rapidinho.
Tá. Você explica. Então, isso meio preocupado, jovem. Vocês viram minha foto. Eu aprendi mais cultura. Como sou cacique, e eu aprendi mais palavra do cacique, ritual que eu tenho. Eu aprendi com mais velho. Eu preocupação mais jovem do Kuikuro, cada etnia, ritual que a gente vai ser igualzinho. Guarupi, dança, ritual bastante nós temos. Guaurá que dança, Camará, tudo igual. Calapalo. 4 aldeias é Caribe. Nosso língua, igualzinho. Caribe, 4. Kuikuro, Calapalo, Machipu, Napuá. Aruaki, Yorapiti, Guaurá, Meinac. Mais Tupi, a língua Tupi, Camará, o Cauaiuete, Awiti. Então, mais Gé, palavra mais para lá, essa pessoa. Então, Alto Xingu, igual, tradicional, só que a língua é diferente. Tá? Gente, já foi, eu lutei, fazer luta com Cauca, eu ganhava muito, povo lá no Xinguano, cada um. Então, isso eu aprendi mais com cultura. Hoje, está muito preocupado com o jovem, não aprende mais com aquela história, não aprende mais com o canto. Então, isso leva para mim muito minha preocupação. Mais que roda do Xingu, mais preocupado. Isso é verdade que estou falando para você. Tá?
So he notes that in the Xingu, several different peoples share the traditions of Kuikuro, the same celebrations, the same festivals, the same rituals, especially the Carib people, who share the same linguistic family and the same traditions, but all of the Xingu share those traditions. And he notes that because he's a cacique, he learned, especially learned that cultural tradition, especially dedicated himself to learning the memory of those cultural traditions, their ways of speaking of the leader, he said as well, and that his main preoccupation is with the youth and with the future of that knowledge today. Eu acho que foi isso, né? Mas eu tô coisa. Okay.
Yes.
Is the territory protected? Is there a fence around it, or how do they keep people from coming in, hunting?
They cut a line in the forest, and in the past have impounded vehicles of people who cross that line. It's kind of a tense border sometimes. They gained a small piece of land at the southern part of the border just a few years ago, and the moment that they put up a flag, it was shot through with big shotgun blasts and whatnot. So it's a tense thing. Ele está perguntando sobre como vigiar as fronteiras do parque, se tem uma cerca. Eu estava explicando que tem uma picada que abriu. seguro as fronteiras.
Só que hoje não tem assim, para ajuda, fazer picada abrir nossa área, né? Está difícil para hoje a FUNAI, está difícil para colega nosso procurar ajuda, não tem mais. Assim mesmo que roda do Xingu, marcada, preocupação mais se eu quero assim abrir para não entrar madeireiro, para não entrar aquele que madeireiro que está roubando dentro do área. Essa é a minha preocupação. Bom, tenha.
Eu vou complementar um pouco a fala do cacique sobre a demarcação de terra indígena, porque a gente tem uma associação, uma organização que chama TICS, né? A TICS é uma associação terra indígena e está trabalhando com ISA. A gente criou o governança do Xingu chama gestão territorial, que a gente chama, hoje em dia, existe, na verdade, só isso no papel. A gente criar, só que na prática mesmo, assim, prática, a gente não está praticando isso. Porque, né, muito tempo, na época quando a sede da FUNAI ficava em Brasília, ele era muito forte. Quando mudou a sede, Serra, Xingu, em Canarana, ele foi enfraquecendo cada vez mais, porque a FUNAI mandava equipe para fazer uma picada cada ano. Hoje em dia não, hoje em dia ficou muito difícil a equipe da FUNAI e mandar algumas equipes para fazer isso picada em cada ano, porque isso aconteceu em 1990, pouco que tinha acontecido. Quando entrou 2000, nunca mais aconteceu como é que eu digo assim, abrir mais picada. 90 caras não cataram, picada que não se não aqui, hoje até agora nunca aconteceu abrir o mais picado. Mas tem lá marco, né? Marco que cada
40 quilômetros.
Cada 40 quilômetros tem um marco de demarcação, a data de demarcação, ano de demarcação, na picada. Você encontra, você vai abrindo aquele picado, vai encontrando aquele marco de quando foi demarcada aquela terra de justiça.
Que é a picada?
Uma estrada.
They open up like a 10-meter wide path in the forest.
Should go along with that.
Yeah, every 40 kilometers they have a stake, and formerly the National Indian Foundation would send a team to open up a swath of open forest along the borders. That hasn't happened in recent years because of the lack of resources. Some groups, not these guys, but their neighbors to the north, we mentioned the Kaipo, have their own plane and flyover. They do opportunistic monitoring of the borders, particularly where they hit rivers and things like that. But it's a huge amount of work to cut these lines through the forest. And so without the support of the National Indian Foundation, it's hard for them to maintain that boundary line.
You need to go wall.
Excuse me. Oh, nice. Yeah.
I don't want to, I'll ask you, this is a question for both of you, so maybe we can do something. I don't want to undermine the scientific process or the nodes of historical memory, but I'm wondering if there have been any moments when you, in your collaboration with your work, where you suddenly realize you've been working with it, you finally figure out something that is like an important historical insight, and you've gone and you've shared this with your collaborators, and they've been like, oh yeah, we knew that already. Like, that it's already part of a form of historical knowledge that's just differently structured than the kind of historical knowledge you're creating? Do you understand my question?
Yeah, I'm going to tell you a story, and then I'm going to translate it to Afukaka. But when I first lived there in 1992, they have a mythological culture hero who they believe carved his legs down into spikes, and because of great sadness, scoured the earth and created the ditches. And they also believe that the ceramics were not only divine, but if you touched them, they'd create diarrhea, which was a real problem for getting an archaeological team together. Fortunately, a couple of his son-in-laws who had the power to demand that they go into the field with me and did get diarrhea. Over time, we've been able to work that out. But he was in mourning the entire first year that I was there, and he was really the primary proponent and always has been, not only for the cultural heritage mapping and archaeology, but for scientific research in this area. And at the very end, he said, listen, I want you to take me out and show you what you've been doing for months and months and months. So we went out and walked around, and I showed him what I thought was an old trash bin, and where I thought a house was, where I thought the plaza was, and we walked along one of the roads and went over one of the ditches. And we got into the woods next to the ditch. He says, listen, I've told you our story about our cultural ancestor, Kitsi, they call him. And I like your story better. I have another story to tell you. And he told me a story about some Kuikuro who were captured, and they were taken to a town or village that had 2 palisade walls, and the Kuikuro jumped over the palisade wall and escaped. But it's a more recent historical narrative that actually very clearly is a reference to those big fortified villages. And then he said to me, I believe you in this site. I can't wait to get over to the other one where I can show you where one of the real earthworks of Kitsi was. And so it's this constant exchange back and forth. But one thing for me, which is absolutely remarkable, is I was talking with Camila about this. A walk through the woods with my friend Afukaka is just remarkable. It's every single plant. Not only does he know its kind of general name, he knows its personal name, Frank and Bill, that he has an intimate relationship with things, and their ability, much of what we've done has been driven by him saying, oh, I've noticed this happening. What can we think about that? In relationship to things dying off and fish getting reduced and fires happening more frequently. They're so keenly attuned. And it's so important if we think about the production of scientific knowledge, if we can tap into that level of intimate, remember when I said corporeal knowledge? I mean, they just have a cartography. It's not written down. This is not, formulaic knowledge the way that we do, but it's equally complex, and I think in many respects is as likely to provide solutions to problems today. Now I'm going to translate for ela perguntou se durante nossos trabalhos se tinha descobertas que era contrário à história, uma coisa arqueológica, que é contrário, o dúplico, uma coisa que você já conheceu no conhecimento, como nossa parceria, eu conversando com você, trocando ideias sobre história, mudou as ideias de história de vocês. Eu contei a história de Kitsi, aquela história do Kuikuro que foi pego pelo outro grupo, naquela aldeia de cerca e tudo isso. Mas ela quis se você tem alguma história que pode...
Eu expliquei para Michael história onde aquilo é Xingu, só plano. Onde está a terra preta, tem valeta. A gente fala, aquele bicho abriu aquele buraco. Outro cerca, onde que não entra inimigo, lá no Amazonas. Lá que a história do pessoal cercava a aldeia com madeira, para não entrar inimigo. Essa história agora com o Michael, né? Aí eu falei pro Michael, essa aí é história nossa também. Eu acreditei o trabalho dele com arqueólogo, onde joga a terra para cá, dentro da... Dentro do fora. Dentro do fora, aquele valeta, jogando muito pedaço de cerâmica antigo, sempre para cá. Então eu contei para ele. Antes de contava ele fazer trabalho, né?
You know so much more. I feel like you can do a better job.
Okay. Well, it was the same story. He was saying how, you know, he brought me to the sites, and this is absolutely the case. Every site we've identified is because they already know about it. It's terra preta, it's dark earth, it has a very different type of forest composition, it has very different soil characteristics, which also are wonderful for growing things. So they map right onto them. But how he brought me to the sites, and he was talking about their story of it's a spirit being. He said bicho animal, but it's a spirit being, that being Pizzi that I mentioned, who carved his legs down, scoured the earth. And then the stories of up in Amazonas, mas como o nome daquele cara? Que pulou a cerca. Yeah, that's the name of the individual that jumped the fence. Yeah, and this is the remarkable thing. I have to add here that many people have an idea that kind of indigenous knowledge, indigenous understandings are somewhat monolithic, and there's kind of some Amerindian generalized view of how the world is. And what's been so remarkable to me over the years is how dynamic and adaptive it is, and how it's not that they trade their indigenous views for a view from somewhere else, but it's the French anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss called it bricolage. You know, they kind of pick and fit things together as needed. And there's always another story. And it helps to kind of encompass new types of information that are coming in. And so one thing I have to say, we've never had a disagreement. I have to say, we're very, very close friends. And we've never had a major disagreement about things. But basically, it's because there's always this common ground that you can find as you're kind of seeking out knowledge. One thing leads you in a different direction. And honestly, more than the kind of, obviously, you write grants to the National Science Foundation, you have to have a problem and a hypothesis and a null hypothesis and all of that. And as often as not, I do that judiciously, but there's a certain amount of fabrication in there, in the sense that, okay, we will do the question and answer trial and error testing of scientific analysis, knowing full well that when you get out in the middle of the Amazon tropical forest, out in the middle of sites that are completely unknown, in forests where the really best, not only way to understand them is by asking a man like this rather than looking at a biology book, the questions kind of emerge in place, and they emerge through the dialogue itself. And so it leads you in these completely unexpected ways. Honestly, when I went to do graduate work in the Kuikuro, I was not looking for garden cities or big wide roads or trenches. And that was a mutual process of discovery, but it actually fits something that they feel about themselves or that they know about their history. There was kind of a golden age. There was a time when they were much bigger and much stronger, and then they went through a long period. What we see today in the destruction of their lands and their somewhat indefensibility in the face of modern development is the end of 5 centuries of rough history. Yes, Edgar, I'm going to
Sorry
start.
for insisting, I want to insist with my previous question. Know that we have to be optimistic, but we also pessimistic. When we see that we destroy all this just to feed the pigs in China, with soy, beans, and so on. So I believe that the only solution here, in my opinion, is can be kind of more confrontation. The ICAP is always building a national park. I can mechanism, legal mechanism, penalize it through the company doing. I don't know the specific legislation for Indian territory, so that was my question. If we like scientists, can we produce a very good report demonstrating the impacts, the indirect impact produced by the surrounding areas on the Indian territory? I think that we can trigger some improvements. We are not going to stop it, but what you say, we can try to improve the activities in the surrounding areas.
Absolutely, and this has come up in a couple of instances. Yvonne mentioned it, Camilla mentioned it. We need to know what it is we're talking about, and oftentimes, it's like we're looking at a puzzle and 90% of the pieces are missing. For an archaeologist, we live with that every day. You just have a little tiny remainder of what's around. But honestly, paleontology, geological analysis, you get these little windows into things. And for instance, the banded forests, they just suddenly appeared out of nowhere. I knew they had big villages and I knew they were integrated. We published together articles in Science and other scientific journals about that. And it has had potentially some impact, but all of a sudden these things appeared. And for me, as well as him, it's like, oh my God, this is not a prediction of the forest dying. This is a reflection of the forest dying before our eyes and differentially. And so we'll see what happens, but I absolutely agree with it. It enables us all of a sudden to say, listen, this is what we're looking at in terms of forest. If these were pre-Columbian management systems, then we should expect the biodiversity to be organized this way. If they were managing Pindaiba at a very large scale, we're going to see that in Phytoliths. We're going to understand that. If those were fire control mechanisms, we're going to find in the charcoal on the soil that the darker bands don't have as much charcoal and the lighter bands do. And, we'll see what potentially the impact is. But I absolutely agree with you. First, we need to get it out there, what it is. It is an artifact. It is an index fossil of a ecosystemic biodiversity. This is what functional biodiversity looked like over the past 500 years. We can see it in its minimalist form in contemporary communities, and we can see it in its maximal form in the pre-Columbian villages. Now, how does that respond, for instance, to something like climate change? And then, hopefully, it will have an impact.
I want to just follow up on Edgardo. I know he hates ecohydrology. This seems like a classical ecohydrology problem. They're farming up in the highlands. There's a lot of evapotranspiration. Probably the base level dropping in the groundwater. It's not global climate change. It's exactly what they're doing in the highlands. We've seen it in the Tocantins. You documented it. Is there the way that you would see? So you'd like to know you'd like to know the discharge in the river, if that's been measured. You'd like to know if they have a couple wells with water date, water level monitors in the wells, so you can watch the groundwater going up and down. It's really straightforward in that environment. And I was wondering about water quality. But there's some things here that are very clearly being controlled by that soy farming.
Absolutely. And so the question becomes, how do we mobilize those kinds of scientists to work in an area? And that means partnership.
Do that tomorrow.
No, you can't.
That's tough.
Because you have to ask first. This is what I mean about partnerships and dialogue with indigenous people on their land. Unlike, a farm just outside of Durham where you could just go over and start doing that work, they need to understand what scientists do, why that science is important, how is it relevant for the community, and then how do we deploy multicultural scientific knowledge production. And this has been one of the stumbling points. There's an unwillingness I've found with indigenous people and completely justified in just letting people come in and do things that they have no clue what they are. And in the past, quite honestly, have never had direct relevance to them. It's like they appear in science or they appear in somewhere else. It's like, well, I guess that's good. But, you know, where's the payback? And this is why it's as important as getting the best scientists there is getting the mechanisms for this communication between not science and anti-science, not science and the kind of hostile public. They're hungry to know what we know. But at the same time, they also want us to recognize that, hey, they've got as much packed into their head in history as we do. And how do we make it mutually important? Because I absolutely agree. Now is not the time to be mincing words or wasting time. We want to get the best scientists in there as possible. And it's one of the reasons I have to say that he's here. It's a commitment to this. Takuma is another who's built bridges, and his work with films, which you're going to see later on today, has done as much for consciousness raising of these problems that don't only affect them, but affect everybody else. And so, yeah, let's get on it. Then
ask Afukaka his point of view on like the facts and of the research on his view on how he appropriated this. Então, Afukaka, eu queria te perguntar como você acha que os Kuikuro se apropriaram e usaram e têm usado e que mudou e quais são os efeitos a partir do momento que vocês começaram a colaborar nesse projeto de pesquisa, né, nessa pesquisa. De que maneira isso afetou o dia a dia, as discussões, as conversas, o ativismo?
Ela está perguntando o que significa essas colaborações, o que importa dessas colaborações para a comunidade, e também, como eu falei, não é só eu, mas os nossos colegas brasileiros, Bruno Franqueto e Carlos Fausto, e que é que essas parcerias com nós...
Boa pergunta, né? Trabalho do Mike, Carlos Fausto, Bruna Franqueta, primeiro que entrou lá na minha aldeia, linguista, marido, Carlos, e arqueólogo, não, antropólogo, Mike, arqueólogo Mike, tudo junto. O único eles aí, o Carlos, o Bruno, trazendo o trabalho que ela fez lá na aldeia, linguista, ele voltou para nós, para a comunidade de Kuikuro. O único pesquisador, fazer trabalho que ele faz lá, ele voltou para nós, para ensinar professores de lá, na aldeia. Carlos também está ensinando, ele está aprendendo mais. Tipo de pesquisador que entrou no Camará, Laura, Menaco, nunca botava aquele trabalho que ele fez, trazendo para a comunidade. Ele disse, não, Carlos, Bruno, então por isso que é tipo de... agradecendo o trabalho que ela fez deu muitos anos. Então, ele trazendo para nós, para a comunidade. Michael também está mostrando o trabalho para a comunidade. Carlos Fausto fazer também a mesma coisa. Está mostrando para a comunidade o trabalho que ele fez. Por isso que o único eles aí, pesquisador, que trazendo, voltando para nós, para a comunidade, esse trabalho. Então, a comunidade gosta muito dele. Esse povo aí. É fazer parceria. Tá?
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, I mean, could you translate? That's a little embarrassing for me.
It's knowledge that the Bruno Franqueta, the first person to work with them was a linguist, then Carlos Faust, who is an anthropologist, and then our archaeologist here. Really? Okay. See, you should be doing this. He's saying that what is remarkable about them is that they produce knowledge and they give that knowledge to the community. Then the neighboring indigenous groups where other people are working, that does not happen. They produce knowledge and the knowledge goes to the outside. So it is this relationship that marks the difference that makes it important for him to have, he says, these people are working there.
Yeah, and if I may, the reason that we were here, and once again, thank you all for the invitation to be here. It's very exciting, I think, for all of us to present this stuff and to help raise awareness. But what we'll be doing for the rest of the week in New York, in Connecticut, in DC, is raising money for, we're going to be building fish tanks that are using the pre-Columbian techniques along with Western technology. Because guess what happens when the forest dies? The fish go with it. The wetlands are going to suffer as well. And so one of the questions that this scientific research has precipitated is, well, let's take the worst case scenario. They don't have a forest in 10 years. Very sad, because as I told you, this is a cultural group that is specifically adapted to forest management systems and has been for millennia. And all of a sudden, for the first time in millennium, they're not going to have a forest to work with. But the question becomes, if the forest dies, do they have to die with it? And this is one of the things that we do. And I have to say, from my point of view, that more than hypothesis testing, more than scientific inquiry, more than critical or historical analysis, this work has been driven, and it relates to that earlier question, by what I call the social life of research and the way people become involved in one another's lives. And we're all committed, and I can speak for Bruna and Carlos, we work very closely together, and we're in constant communication with them. We're all committed to the fact that, listen, the battle is at our doorstep. Climate change is easy to look at in an abstract form. Development and deforestation are easy to look at from satellite images, but for these folks, they're potentially looking down the barrel at an existential crisis that comes along with the forest. And this is the time when anthropology is perhaps my day job and pays the bills and doing classes, but I'm really delighted to be here traveling in the U.S., raising consciousness with Afukaka, and hopefully digging into the deep pockets of some financiers here in the United States. Yes? Afukaka wanted to mention that he has brought along on his trip some indigenous artwork. If anyone is interested in, for instance, a wristband or a necklace of theirs, he just wanted, they're quite lovely. I have quite a collection of them, well, but he brought them along in case anybody wants it, as they say, lembranza. Thank you very much.
Yeah. We will screen
No, you did fantastic. You did terrific. No. That foi ótimo que você entrou também. Ele sabe. Na verdade, eu sou dividido. I'm sorry that I didn't get